Chapter 334. The Nero River was the largest river in Medica. It had plenty of water and a wide surface. Therefore, even if the boat went against the current, the sailors would not find it too difficult to paddle. Before Ques's scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce used the Leviathan Behemoth derivative as a carrier to establish an air route between the north and south of the empire, this river was the most commonly used highway by merchants and travelers. Sailing on the river, there was no need to take a long detour due to the mountains in the way, and there was no need to worry about the danger of getting lost. Moreover, there were many cities and villages along the Nero River, so it was easy to get supplies. They set off from Bite City and traveled by land to the city at the mouth of the Nero River. Then, they boarded a specially prepared galleon with enough food and water. More than 30 strong men sat on the lower deck and took turns to row the oars, heading straight for Nome City. Due to the ample preparation, the journey, which originally took more than a month, was shortened to about 10 days. However, Commander Wenfeng still felt that it was too long. As the saying went, if things were delayed, things would change. The scale of perpetual order had given too much time to react. Who knew if the other party had come up with a way to deal with it, or if the Megalosaurus Pasha's hostage would expire and become invalid? There are too many variables on this trip. Standing on the bow deck, Commander Wenfeng looked at the approaching city and thought to himself, but the Grand Vader's conditions are a little too harsh. If I had known this would happen, I would have let my men take full responsibility for the pursuit of the jackdaw. Originally, after dealing with Zagan Pasha, he wanted to use a teleportation spell to reach Nome City directly and go to the headquarters of the Scale of Perpetual Order to hand over the ransom agreement with the Grand Vader. But to his surprise, when the portal was opened, the sorcerers, who were at least at the level of Blackrobe, found that the spatial coordinates of Nome City were greatly disturbed, and they could not teleport at all. Needless to say, it must be a defensive measure to prevent a surprise attack on the headquarters after the other party learned that Keys was under attack. That was indeed the case. When Snade had brought everyone back to Nome, he had immediately activated the defensive lock-like defensive device that he and the young Blue Dragon had developed and deployed together, guarding against the Grand Vader's teleportation ambush. At the same time, the Pasha territory originally controlled by Keys had also entered a state of full combat readiness. They were always on guard against the Medici army that could appear at any time, regardless of whether the other party obeyed Pharaoh or the Grand Vader. Of course, Pharaoh was the highest ruler of this land. Within the Pasha's territory, there were some towns and cities that were further away from Nome and the Dragon Nest. They did not strictly follow the administrative and military orders issued by Nome City. However, the nearby cities, such as Sparud on the Nero River, where Commander Wenfeng was about to arrive, had already entered a state of military control. Everyone was on edge. Commander Wenfeng was very sure of this, especially when he saw the ballista on the dock aiming at his ship. He no longer had any doubts about the information that his men had gathered. "Be careful, but don't show your weapons," he ordered loudly, making sure that all the sailors on the galleon could hear him. "After all, we are only here to negotiate, not to start a war." If the sailors on this ship were ordinary sailors, his order would have been almost impossible, because no sailor would be willing to obediently put down their weapons when someone aimed a ballista at them. However, those who served on the ship were all carefully selected people who had heard the news. Naturally, they would not question the orders of their own commander. Even if the other party ordered them to commit suicide immediately, they would gladly do so without any hesitation. Listen to the defenders on the shore. Our galleon needs to dock and head to Nome City near Sparud. His Excellency the Grand Vexual has an important letter that needs to be delivered to the Consul of Nome City. For the safety of the Megalosaurus Pasha and yourselves, do not rashly open fire. Otherwise, the next wave of ships sailing towards Sparut will not be the small boats of diplomats, but the thousands of warships of the Medici army. The one who shouted was the leader of the sailors. He was also one of the men who had heard the news. Although there were spellcasters on Wenfeng's side, and they could use voice transmission spells, they were now in a state of mutual hostility. In order to prevent the other party from misunderstanding and causing more trouble or even attacks, They could only use this more primitive method to communicate. Communication was basically done by shouting, but it was good. Of course, it was also possible that the message was very useful to the defenders on the shore. In any case, the ballista that looked like it would only take one shot to destroy the entire galleon did not fire. The defenders on the shore sent out a special navigator to guide the galleon to a special berth at the dock. From the information gathered by the men who had heard the news, Sparut was nominally under the jurisdiction of the consul, but in reality, it was controlled by the leader of an underground organization called Glove. And this Glove was a spy that the Megalosaurus Pasha had placed in the city. As the leader of Medici's spies, Commander Winfong was actually looking forward to meeting this Glove. He wanted to test the bottom line of this person's loyalty. Even if he could not use this person for himself, he could at least add a nail to Keyes' seemingly monolithic camp so that it would be easier to break them down one by one in the future. But Glove did not give him this opportunity. Commander Winfong and his men did not even enter Sparut. Instead, 2 teams of defenders brought some camel beasts and escorted them directly to Nome City under the guise of guards. Sparut was only about a day's journey from Nome City. Since it was related to the safety of the Megalosaurus Pasha, the team had to maintain a fast pace. In addition, the scale of perpetual order had paid for the roads to be repaired for the convenience of transportation. After walking for about 10 hourglasses, Commander Winfong saw the walls of Nome City. During the Japanese invasion, the city had been burned down. Because it was used to make obsidian magic orbs to support the portal, less than 1/10 of the people in the city had survived. But now, in less than a year, after Keyes' management, the city had regained its vitality after the tournament. More and more people from the surrounding area had come to settle down here. After entering the city gate, Commander Winfong saw many merchants coming and going, as well as a bustling commercial market that was comparable to Byte. I hope this city, or the scale of perpetual order, can get 33 million silver cats. Otherwise, if such a thriving city of Medici is destroyed again, I'll have to commit many more sins. Chapter 335. After using an escape spell to escape from Byte City, Snade used a directional teleportation spell to bring the young blue dragon and his companions back to Nome City. The scale of perpetual order also carried out a strategic retreat. After being ambushed, everyone was more or less injured. Only the ogre gourmet, Brew, fell ill because of the poison. In order to detoxify and heal him, the witch Dr. Paru had put in a lot of effort, but there was no improvement. He even had to concoct some highly toxic drugs in an attempt to fight poison with poison. If not for Brew's poison resistance, Paru's drugs would have been able to kill an ordinary ogre. It was not until the Demolic created a new steampunk-style body for himself that Brew's injuries stopped worsening with the help of the legendary spellcaster and the new anti-poison drugs developed by Paru that Brew's injuries were no longer worsening. However, his life was still in danger. Seeing his brother enduring the pain, his healthy brown skin gradually turned into an ominous grayish-green. Some parts of his body had begun to shrink, and his weight had decreased by more than 1/3. Paru finally made up his mind. He would use his and Brew's lives as a wager to try a special treatment method. Blue, and I might be in danger. The ogre shaman stood in front of Blue's sickbed and tiptoed slightly to pat Blue's shoulder. Facing his brother, who was almost half his height, the shaman instructed earnestly, If, and I'm saying if, both of us don't wake up, you mustn't recklessly seek revenge on the Great Vader. Come with us. I believe that, given enough time, you'll definitely grow into the strongest ogre. There's no one like you." Tears streamed down from the eyes of the ogre Neru. Although he wanted to stop Paru from taking the risk, this was the only way to save Brew. He could only give it a try. "Please, Master Snade." After instructing his brother, the ogre voodoo doctor looked at the steampunk half-lich who had been collaborating with him for a long time. "Later, please help us set up a barrier. This voodoo spell, there won't be any interference." The exhaust pipe on Snade's body spewed out steam, making a whistling sound. He interrupted Peru's words. "Within half an hourglass, I promise with the real name of the spellcaster that you'll be able to do it. If..." Originally, Snade wanted to say that if the voodoo spell failed, he would use a necromancy spell to resurrect Brew and Brew in another form. However, considering that it was not appropriate to disturb Brew's state of mind before casting the spell, he swallowed his words halfway. It was true that Snader, who was born in the Drow race, did not understand what friendliness and compassion were. However, as a research scholar, he deeply understood the principle of learning alone without friends and learning alone without friends, which meant that Snader was ignorant and ignorant. Through the cooperation with Paru, the proud and arrogant half-lich recognized this ogre voodoo doctor. With his knowledge and ability in the field of voodoo and biological modification, Snade thought that Paru was a rare academic exchange partner. Then, thank you very much. With a buzzing sound, a light blue barrier appeared in Brew's ward, enveloping Brew and his doctor, Paru. After isolating themselves from any external disturbances, Paru looked at his brother, who was lying on the bed. "Next time when you eat," he said as he raised a troll's skull staff in his hand, "don't put anything into your mouth." As he said this, he took out a ceremonial bone dagger from the troll's skull staff and stabbed it into Brew's heart. Brew was poisoned, and his smelly blood spurted out like spring water. However, at this moment, it seemed to be grasped by a pair of invisible hands and condensed into a huge blood ball that hovered at the tip of the dagger and rotated. Seeing this, Paru did not hesitate. He quickly changed the direction of the dagger and cut open the artery on his thigh, allowing his blood to mix with Brew's poison blood. Voodoo's secret spell, Poison Transfer. The ogre witch doctor endured the feeling of powerlessness caused by the massive blood loss and decisively cast a secret spell to transfer all the poison in Brew's body into his own body. During the process of casting the spell, he carefully controlled the location of the poison, avoiding many important organs, and blocked the poison in his feet, the extremities of his limbs that were the furthest away from his organs and brain. As the poison was transferred out, the grayish-green color on Brew's skin faded at a visible speed. However, the wound caused by the ceremonial dagger in his heart was still fatal, and he was still on the verge of death. Under the influence of the poison, the ogre witch doctor's feet quickly festered, and grayish-green spots instantly spread to his calves. Paru made a prompt decision and used the last of his strength to break the troll's skull staff into two halves. Voodoo's secret spell, Troll's Gift. The troll's skull staff was made from Paru's spine and skull. Through a unique secret spell, the unique vitality of the troll race was preserved. At the most critical moment, Paru would have a chance to heal his body. At this moment, he passed this gift to the dying Brew. Light brown mucus flowed out from the broken part of the staff. Paru poured all of it into Brew's chest that had been pierced by the ceremonial bone dagger and covered the surface of his damaged heart. This troll's gift allowed Brew's wounds to heal rapidly. Just like a real troll, other than using acid and fire to completely kill them, even if they were chopped into pieces, the pieces could grow into new troll children. Seeing Brew's chest start to beat again, Paru's heart was half at ease. He felt a little dizzy, but the healing process did not stop. The ogre witch doctor licked the brown liquid on the broken part of the staff and held it in his mouth. Then, without any hesitation, he picked up the sharp dagger and slashed at his own knee. Paru lay in a pool of blood. He used a legendary voodoo staff and his own legs as the price to save Brew's life. Seeing that the secret spell was completed, the half-lich Snade, who was waiting at the side, quickly removed the protective barrier and used magic to stop Paru's bleeding. The ogre Nalu rushed to his brother's side. He glanced at Blue to make sure that his chest was beating vigorously. He then carried Blue's body and placed him on another bed that had been prepared beforehand. Things that can't kill us. Neru straightened his body. Although the room had been raised, the ogre's head was still close to the ceiling. After eating them, we'll become stronger. Eat. Perhaps because he heard the familiar words, the ogre gourmet, who had been unconscious for a few days, murmured softly and repeated Neru's words. Chapter 336. As the head of the spies, Commander Wenfeng's heart was as firm as a rock. When facing people who had few secrets because of their wounds, he could ignore the other party's cries and quietly wait for the result he wanted. but to destroy a city, and a city that belonged to the country he had sworn to protect, and to send the entire city's citizens to the gallows, was not something that was easy to convince himself to do. It required a considerable degree of viciousness. Even if the Grand Vexer used the words "unknown noble cause" to describe the mission they were carrying out, and repeatedly assured him that as long as he obtained the last batch of gold, his spellcasting preparations would be completed. By then, the curse of the Medici Empire and even the Ashen World would be lifted, and their people would obtain inexhaustible energy, and the land would burst forth with more vitality. However, Commander Wenfeng had always been skeptical of this, but out of loyalty to the Grand Vexer, he carried out the order. In the future, if anyone mentions noble cause to me, I will definitely tell them to stay as far away as possible. Riding on the back of a hunchback, Commander Wenfeng entered the inner city of Nome. He did not even need to use his eyes to observe. The unfriendly gazes cast at him made him feel like there were thorns in his back, especially those unknown ones. Approaching the garden square in the center of the city, he saw the strategic teleportation portal built by the Wusan, as well as the ruins of the city's governor's mansion. After all of them were razed, Nome's new public facilities were rebuilt. As he went deeper into the city, Commander Wenfeng found more and more novel things that had not appeared even in Beitar. For example, many of the streets here had railway tracks in the air. From time to time, there would be cars that were emitting thick smoke and making whining noises as they pulled goods or pedestrians quickly across the streets. Another example was that he saw many small pavilions on the streets, and pedestrians would use 1 or 2 copper coins to buy printed papyrus to read. He ordered someone to buy a copy and found that it was similar to Beitar's official newspaper, but the content was richer: business information, local customs, and customs of Medicus. There was even a brief report about the attack on Megalosaurus Pasha. No wonder. He looked at the papyrus printed with the trademark of the Scales of Eternity in his hand. The text on it was full of speculation about the motives of the Grand Vader, Commander Wenfeng, and the others. Since entering this city, I have received so much hostility. He understood this kind of advertising method, but after some careful consideration, Wenfeng immediately realized another problem. That's not right. The bulletin here will be sold to the normal citizens. The literacy rate of the citizens here has reached a very high level. Thinking of this, he could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. The increase in the literacy rate not only meant that the cultural quality of the city's citizens had improved, but it also meant that the ordinary people here had gradually broken away from the category of ignorance and were beginning to be able to use knowledge to arm their minds. Learning knowledge was once a privilege of the aristocracy, even in Bite City, which was the richest city in Medici. As a spy chief, he was well aware of the power of knowledge. At the same time, he was also well aware of the collateral value of knowledge, the ability to think rationally, which spread and infected like a plague. A single spark could start a prairie fire. Since the people of Nome City had developed wisdom, then what about the other cities adjacent to Nome City? What about the cities that had close trade with Nome City? What about the foreign tribes that were gradually approaching the dragon's territory? As far as he knew, it had been more than 10 days since the Megalosaurus Pasha was captured by the Grand Vader, but none of the cities that had established commercial trade routes with the Scale of Eternity Order had taken the initiative to terminate their cooperation. The value of Nome City, or even the values of Nome City, had now been widely recognized. Even if those cities were still under the rule of the Pasha and the Archons, the foundation of their rule, the aristocratic system of Medici, had been shaken by Nome. As for the regional and emerging business aristocrats, it could be seen from the fact that they did not take the initiative to terminate their cooperation with the Scale of Eternity Order that they were very dependent on Nome. Ransom, they must pay enough wealth, Commander Wenfeng secretly calculated in his heart. According to the information he had obtained, although the daily operations of the Scale of Eternity Order would not be personally participated by the Megalosaurus Pasha, its integrated resources and power could be completely borrowed from the power of Keys, the Megalosaurus. The young blue dragon was the core that united the Scale of Eternity Order. They could not give up on such a leader. Commander Wen Feng sorted out his thoughts and found that the burden on his shoulders had suddenly become heavier. Even if we need to start a small-scale war, we will not hesitate to do it for the ransom. Only in this way can we reduce the speed of development of the scale of eternity. Let the Grand Vader's experiment be completed first, and prevent the Medici Empire from being divided into different classes and causing even more destructive turmoil. He waved his hand. It was not a spell, but a signal with the hand gesture that they had agreed on before. The eyes of the two elite sniffers beside him lit up, and they immediately threw out two chimera-modified, telepathic palace guards without leaving a trace. As soon as they landed, they hid in the shadows of the street corner. According to the instincts of living creatures, these telepathic palace guards that had different voice messages recorded in advance would follow the pheromones, and these pheromones were smeared in the corners of the streets and alleys by the sniffers who had infiltrated Gnome City earlier. The telepathic palace guards relied on their small bodies to follow the route planned by the pheromones without attracting attention, and finally arrived at a preset safe house in the city. After the sniffers waiting there received the message, they would immediately think of a way to encrypt the message and send it out of Gnome City. But the two elite sniffers who threw the telepathic palace guards did not expect that their little pets had not gone far. To be precise, they had just turned a corner in the street when they encountered a separated skeleton puppet. Although the separated skeleton puppet was only the size of a mouse, it was enough to deal with the telepathic palace guards. Under the orders of the kobold leader of the Dragonborn clan, who led them to set up a defensive circle, the telepathic palace guards were quickly captured alive. Then they were immediately taken away and sent to the steampunk Demolika's laboratory, where Snader personally analyzed the voice message. The production cost of the telepathic palace guards is 25 silver cats each, and the breeding cost is 15 silver cats. Please make the corresponding compensation. Hearing this message, steam spewed out from the exhaust pipe behind Snader, and two whistles sounded. At this time, a patrolling eagle with a note tied to its claw in advance was flying quickly to the north, and there were two other patrolling eagles still circling above Gnome City, waiting for Commander Wen Feng's new orders. Chapter 337. A team of bandits was walking in the vast desert. Many bandits had scarves or handkerchiefs loosely tied around their necks. They had tattoos on their bodies that symbolized their affiliation with the bandits. They also had beards, and their heads were wrapped in white cloth headscarves used to block the burning of the eternal blaze. Some of the sailors looked old, but they were actually not that old. They were at most in their 20s or 30s. Their skin was dark brown, and their faces were full of wrinkles. They had been baptized by wind and sand. The skin of the real old bandits was like a melted candle. Most of the older sailors were silent. The scarves around their necks were always pulled up to cover their mouths and noses. Their headscarves were so low that they almost covered their eyes. They were alert. Most of the bandits carried more than one weapon: machetes, daggers, bows and arrows, crossbows. In a unique culture of the bandit circle, the more weapons they had, the more powerful they were. Most of those weapons were obtained from battles, and such battles included, but were not limited to, robbing small desert elf tribes, attacking caravans, and fighting between bandit gangs. These people's hometowns were all over the place: Gnome City, Sparut City, Rust City, Bite City, Taka City. Some of them were even the remnants of the Japanese expeditionary army that had been scattered before, and the one leading them was an elite team of sniffers. About a year ago, this group of bandits was like a mass of loose sand scattered in the vast central and southern areas of Medica. They relied on the trade routes between oases, the weapons in their hands, and their true abilities to do a happy business without any cost. However, since Megalosaurus Pasha ruled the central territories of Medica, the scale of perpetual order rose rapidly. These bandits, who were originally going to make a fortune from the development of trade, were in big trouble. How could the young Blue Dragon let go of those who affected the development of the Chamber of Commerce? That was an important carrier for him to gradually grow his power. As a result, These bandits who used to roam the desert became the main targets of the Megalosaurus Pasha from the moment he took office. Apart from the Dragonborn clan, the kobolds would form patrols under the leadership of the young blue dragon in the dragon's lair to regularly encircle and annihilate bandit gangs within their territories. The scale of perpetual order had also set bounties for the heads of many famous bandits. Death, escape, death, injury. In the short span of a year, with Gnome City as the center, there were no longer any large bandit gangs in the surrounding hundreds of perescents. As for the smaller gangs, which usually only had a few dozen or even a few members, they could not attack the cities where the terminal was built and where the forces of the scale of perpetual order had stationed themselves. When they wanted to rob the caravans by land, they had to think twice before robbing them. They had to see if they were a match for the caravan guards so that they could not rob them, and their heads would be borrowed as evidence to exchange for the bounty. Just as these bandits were trembling in fear and anxiety, the sniffer unit began to make arrangements for them in advance. Many of the bandit gangs had spies infiltrated before. After their leaders were hunted down and killed or died in various accidents, these sniffer unit elites all emerged and became the new leaders of the bandit gangs. They took their subordinates and left the territory of the Megalosaurus Pasha. They carried out small-scale activities in the territories of other Pasha and rested. At the same time, this group of people also secretly formed a bandit alliance. The new leaders of each bandit gang, who were originally the elite members of the sniffer unit, gathered together and used various methods to eliminate dissidents and strengthen their own forces in the local area. Following the orders of the sniffer unit commander, this group of bandits who had been reunited formed an alliance and began to move towards the hinterland of the Megalosaurus Pasha. They wanted to take back the wealth and glory that should have belonged to them. Of course, to put it nicely, these people were pawns. To put it bluntly, they were full of cannon fodder. The purpose of Sniffer Unit Commander's use of this secret chess piece was to bring more pressure to the scale of perpetual order, so as to force them to accept his ransom request. The reason why the Bandit Alliance was the vanguard was that Pharaoh's attitude was still unclear. He had not declared Keyes a traitor, so it was not in line with the rules to send a regular army to his territory. Moreover, according to the information obtained, the Megalosaurus Pasha's ability to create territories was not weak. The cities under its control were tough bones that were difficult to chew. The several legions of the Megalosaurus Pasha had either experienced the invasion of the Japanese or resisted the demon disaster. If they launched another attack on the Blue Dragon's territory, there would definitely be heavy losses. However, it did not matter to the Bandit Alliance. Even if they all died in battle, Sniffer Unit Commander would not feel the slightest bit of heartache. Instead, he would feel fortunate that he did not have to deal with the dregs of the Empire in the future. Of course, in order to not let these cannon fodder die in vain, Sniffer Unit Commander still prepared some new weapons for them. The Bandit Alliance had seized more than 10 cannons and a large amount of ammunition through several robberies. Thanks to the help of these weapons, they were able to pose a certain degree of threat to the cities in the territory of the Megalosaurus Pasha. Bosses, riding a camel beast from the back of the team to the front of the team, a bandit leader with a light blue headscarf shouted. He was responsible for looking after the supply vehicles, and there were some situations that he had to report to the sniffer who led the team. There's a problem with the wheel hubs of those vehicles again. The barrels of those cannons are still too heavy, and this is the 13th. No, the 14th time that the wheel hubs have broken today. The carpenters said that the places that can be reinforced with rivets have been nailed full. Then what do you think? The sniffer who was disguised as the leader asked indifferently, "Boss, we haven't used this thing before. All we have to do is prepare a group of people and shoot a round of fire arrows into the city. Those nobles in the city who are afraid of death will be scared and obediently give us the silver coins." The whip flew through the air and hit the face of the blue headscarf with a pah sound. It was so painful that he trembled, but he still did not dare to cry out. Is the sound of the whip loud? But is far worse than the sound of cannons. There is no sound louder than the sound of cannons, especially when the sound is in your ears. With a voice that was close to an aria, the sniffer leader of the bandit alliance patiently taught his subordinates. That feeling was like being punched by nothingness. The explosion makes you scared and dizzy. You don't know if the world is really shaking or if it is just your eyes deceiving you. But it doesn't matter at all, because fear will seize your heart first. Looking at the confused expression of his subordinates, the sniffer shook his head and thought, "What's the point of talking to cannon fodder?" So he put on a serious face and said sternly, "Whips and fire arrows can't scare our new target. You definitely didn't make a living in this place before. Old brother, you definitely didn't run out of this place before. Look at the color of your headscarf. Only cannons can work." After being scolded, the bandit leader instantly understood a lot. Chapter 338. Translator, Nyoibo, Studio Editor. Nyoibo Studio. The calm Nero River flowed quietly. Several capable men in the Sand Bandit Alliance, who used to work as carpenters in Medici, assembled several wagons into wooden rafts. Relying on the buoyancy of the current and the traction of the people on the riverbank, they finally found a suitable way to transport the heavy cannon barrels. However, the leaders of the bandits, played by the elites, still felt that this group of cannon fodder was a little useless. One had to know that they had repeatedly reminded them that the cannon powder used for launching had to be kept dry and could not be touched by water. However, in order to save effort, some of the Sand Bandit Alliance members directly put a few barrels of cannon powder on rafts. As a result, after a day's journey, the river water soaked the barrels that were used to hold the cannon powder. The cannon powder that could fire more than 10 rounds was wet and completely scrapped. Blue Bandana, who was in charge of the transportation, was not so lucky this time. The thing that hit him in the face was no longer a whip, but a blade. This bloody lesson taught all the bandits a lesson. None of them dared to slack off in the slightest. After 3 to 5 days of travel, the team arrived near the territory of Megalosaurus Pasha. They only needed to travel for one more day to reach Spat City. The Sand Bandit Alliance members rested on the spot while they quietly waited for the orders from the Sand Bandit Alliance members. Whether to advance or retreat was not up to the Sand Bandit Alliance members. It was up to the Sand Bandit Alliance members to decide. After less than 2 days of rest, a patrolling eagle landed in the Sand Bandit Alliance members' tent. It ate its fill of meat and then left. After about an hourglass, the team of several Sand Bandit Alliance members was ready to set off for Spat City. After an entire day of rapid travel, the team, which was made up of the worst scumbags of the Medici Empire, approached Spat City after nightfall. They stopped at a distance that was within the sight of the guards, but beyond the range of their weapons. "Gentlemen, as a rule in our line of work, we will not do stupid things under the command of a madman. Instead, we will act according to our common craziness." According to tradition, the leader of the Sand Bandit Alliance rode on the back of the hunchback and began his speech. Following his words, the bandits under his command burst into laughter, expressing their approval of this opening statement. "Our target is an ancient city. We need its wealth to make up for the damage that the reptile has done to our coffers over the past year. Therefore, I, the leader of the Sand Bandit Alliance, the person in charge of your money bags, would like to initiate a vote. Everyone who wishes to set off a terrifying sandstorm here and take over that city, stomp your feet and shout yes." The crowd loudly expressed their approval, and there were no opposing voices among them. This made the bandit leader very satisfied. For those who object, please shout "not good." Although there was no tradition to prove it, every bandit knew or had seen with their own eyes what happened to those who dared to disobey the leader. Most of the time, their throats were slit, and there were also cases where they were stripped naked and buried under the sand. Therefore, not a single person made sound. Even Pharaoh's parliament of nobles is not this united. The bandit leader roared and announced without any reservation. Instantly, the bandits cheered, as if the wealth promised by the leader was already within their reach. "Then what are you bunch of lazy bums waiting for?" Unsheathing the scimitar at his waist, the bandit leader swung it a few times in the direction of Spat City. His tone changed from that of a gentle breeze to that of a ferocious roar. "Hurry up and set up the cannons. Hurry up and shoot a few cannons at him to greet the consul and those nobles. Ha ha ha. Accompanied by a long and wild laughter, everyone in the Sand Bandit Alliance immediately got busy. Perhaps it was because they had chewed the refreshing tobacco in advance, or perhaps it was because the wealth promised by the leaders stimulated their nerves. But even after a day of rapid marching, these people were still full of energy and did not show any signs of fatigue. Not long after, at least much earlier than the leader expected, the bandits unloaded the cannons from the supply wagons, fiddled with all the parts, and began to pre-aim at Spat City. One had to admit that in terms of controlling weapons, this group of bandits, who could stop children from crying at night in Medic, did have some talent. Even though they had not actually fired a few cannons, some of them had figured out how to aim based on the scales on the cannons. Raise it by 3 scales. A bandit in charge of firing narrowed his eyes and raised his thumb to compare it with the fire on the top of Spat City. He said to his companion, who was in charge of setting up the cannons, "Although it might not hit the top of the city accurately, at least it won't hit outside the city walls. As long as the cannons fly into the city, it doesn't matter what the result is." What else can we do? Lifting the cannon barrel was a physically demanding task, so the bandit who was assigned to this task replied snappily, "We're firing a half-wrist iron bullet. Let alone humans and animals. Even houses will be pierced through or even collapse." "Then do you want to give it a try? How about you light the first cannonball?" "Sure, I'll give it a try. I've seen you fiddling with it before. If it weren't for the fact that I can't remember the numbers, I could also get an easy job." After placing the wooden blocks under the cannons, the bandit who lifted the cannons reached for the torch in the bandit's hand. However, he did not notice that the bandit had secretly pulled out an iron bolt that fixed the cannons and the cannons. Then, the reckless bandit lit the fuse on the torch. The cannon burned and made a hissing sound. He even covered his ears with his hands. Then, with a loud bang, the cannonball was fired. The huge recoil bounced the cannons up and hit the bandit in the lower abdomen. The unlucky bandit flew out miserably and kept vomiting blood. It was obvious that he was going to die soon. The first cannonball fired by the cannons was generally known as the cold cannonball. Because the cannons were still very cold, they were most likely to explode when the cannon powder suddenly exploded. Even if the cannonball did not explode, the recoil would be greater. Coupled with the fact that someone had pulled out the iron bolt that fixed the cannonball, this accident was completely a murder. However, it was only a bandit who died, and the cannon was not damaged. At most, it could be used again with a fixed iron bolt. Therefore, the others did not pay much attention to it and went about their work, sending their greetings to the city of Spat with the incessant sound of cannonballs. Idiot! Glancing at the corpse that was dragged aside, the bandit who was responsible for firing the cannons showed a cruel smile. He did not feel uncomfortable about the murder at all. After all, deception was the true tradition of the bandits. I still owe you 3 silver cats. Let's write it off. Chapter 339. War is Deceit. Crooked Lips curled his lips and said to his brother, One Eye. Standing on the city wall, One Eye took out a small telescope from his waist pouch. It was one of his gains from his life as a bandit. The brass mirror made the telescope almost indestructible, and the clever design allowed it to be folded. He opened the telescope and carefully observed the people outside the city who could be considered as his former colleagues or juniors. Since the night fell last night, the invading enemies would launch a fierce bombardment at Spat City every 1 or 2 hourglasses. Then, they would let the cannons cool down and wait for the next shot. However, because of the illusion array set up in advance, the city in the eyes of the Sand Bandit Alliance was very different from its real location. Most of the cannonballs fired last night actually hit the open space next to the city. Only a few of them missed the target and accidentally brushed against the walls of Spat City. The damage caused by them was only some debris. However, as the eternal blaze slowly rose from the horizon, the effect of the illusionary circles that only worked at night was gradually gone. In half an hourglass at most, the true appearance of the city would be exposed to the enemy. Through the raised lens, One Eye used his remaining eye to carefully observe the army outside the city. Bows, javelins, machetes, and shields glittered in the low-angle sunlight. In addition, in his eyes, groups of cavalry in the vanguard moved quickly through the camp, stirring up smoke and dust. This scene seemed to remind him of some of his experiences when he was a bandit. He seemed to be able to hear the rippling and clanking of chain armor. At the rear of the camp, there was a long supply line, but it lacked effective management. A large group of mules, 6 groups of horses, and various camels were hastily tied to wooden stakes that were temporarily inserted into the sand. They didn't even have time to unload the various military supplies they carried. If this team was a regular army of Medici, then in addition to the soldiers fighting in the front line, there would be more corresponding personnel in the rear, auxiliary soldiers, cooks, weaponsmiths, and carpenters. These people would take care of everything neatly. However, for a team composed entirely of bandits, other than daring to risk their lives, what else could they ask for? Those fellows are just a bunch of mobs. Crooked Mouth stretched lazily. The bombardment last night had affected his quality of sleep. He patted the sturdy battlements on the city walls and spoke to the nervous soldiers around him who were tightly gripping their weapons. They only dare to gather around the city because they have more people. Impudent, that's the word. Sir, they have cannons, and a soldier who looked to be about 17 or 18 years old said timidly, but was immediately interrupted by Crooked Mouth. Hey, little soldier, I'm sure you've never fought in a war before. You've never seen a real battle. Crooked Mouth stretched out an index finger and waved it in front of the young soldier. That's just a group of bandits, not an army. Do you see their highboard ships loaded with supplies? Do you see that they have a caravan that stretches several parasan lengths? Every time those cannons fired, they would have 1 less cannonball and 1 less batch of cannon powder. They've been fighting all night yesterday, and they definitely won't have enough ammunition today. Otherwise, Pharaoh would be the leader of the bandits because they're better equipped than Medici's most elite troops. They had to admit that Crooked Mouth's words sounded reasonable. Coupled with his teasing tone, everyone's nervous mood relaxed a lot for a moment, except for One Eye, who was holding a brass telescope and counting something attentively. 3, 6, 12. He calculated silently in his heart. When did the bandits become so rich? They've been firing cannons all night and more than 100 cannonballs, and there's still less than half of the stock left? Humph! It's most likely the handiwork of His Excellency, the Great Vader. At the same time, some of the bandits outside the city also stared at Spat's city and frowned. Looking at the direction of the cannons and the city under the eternal blaze, the Sniffer, as the leader of the bandits, thought for a moment and realized what was going on. Damn camouflage! The bombardment last night was not in the right place at all. He began to feel anxious. Last night, more than half of the ammunition had been used up. If the bombardment continued at the same frequency, the remaining gunpowder in the morning would be completely used up. At that time, even if he gave up on using iron core cannonballs and ignored the risk of exploding, he would just find some random rocks to grind and stuff into the cannonballs. Without the precise ratio of gunpowder, those cannonballs would become a pile of useless metal lumps. Nothing could be fired. For Commander Wen Feng's order, he had to let these bandits attack the city walls of Spat City in person. Not only did attacking a city require the sacrifice of men, but also required enthusiasm and anticipation for the siege, as well as willpower to face the trampled corpses at close range. Although these could all be lured with money, there was a time limit. Especially after yesterday's rapid march and the sleepless bombardment, the leader of the bandits knew very well that his men must be exhausted and close to exhaustion. No matter how much tobacco they chewed, even Medici's most elite royal guards would not be able to withstand the fatigue. He did not think that these scumbags without any honor could overcome it with their willpower. If they were pushed to the extreme, it was hard to guarantee that these people would not mutiny on the spot. He was not worried about his own life. The ones who had infiltrated the bandit alliance were an elite team of snipers. In the worst-case scenario, they were confident that they could break out of the encirclement together, but he was worried about fulfilling Commander Wen Feng's orders. Rather than that, it was better to let these bandits attack the city walls first while they still had some energy to put some pressure on the defenders. Then, He would greatly reduce the frequency of the bombardment and let the cannons delay the defenders for a day or two. Based on the information he had gathered, the Sand Rhino caravan under the scale of perpetual order would travel between Nome and Spat every once in a while to carry out the regular trade. When the time came, he would release these trained bandits to loot the caravan. Not only would they be able to replenish some supplies, they would also be able to satisfy the lust of these scumbags for destruction. And at the same time, they would be able to put some pressure on the other side. 3 birds with 1 stone. Thinking of this, he immediately raised his hand and gestured to the signaler. While we're cooking and resting for 2 hourglasses, let the carpenters seize the time and piece together the siege ladder that can be built to the top of the city wall. Chapter 340. The short break allowed many bandits to breathe a sigh of relief. Considering that they had not slept for the whole day, the leader of the group, the sniffer, specially asked the chefs to make a pot of stew with spices to soothe their stomachs. Eat, drink, fill your stomachs as much as possible, the leader in charge of distributing food shouted. He mimicked the expression of animals when they were wolfing down food. The flesh on his cheeks trembled, and from time to time, he would make a lulu lulu sound. Rest for a while more, then we'll pull out our knives and go forward. We'll put on a good show in front of those shivering old men. Some of the young bandits listened to his advice and tried to eat as much as possible so that when the shields hit them, they would be bounced off by their round stomachs. However, the older bandits were used to big scenes of life and death battles. At this time, they ate slowly. Although they did not eat much, they would make sure that every mouthful of food was fully chewed. Eating was also a skill, especially before the battle. Anyone with experience knew that the most dangerous thing was not the shields that hit them, but the machetes and spears that were impossible to guard against. A stomach full of undigested food would not only make your mind slow, your body clumsy, and there was a possibility that your chest and abdomen would be cut open and could not be stitched up. However, eating too little was not good. Swinging a machete to chop the enemy's skull was also a very heavy physical work. They needed to replenish their energy in advance. After eating their fill, some bandits could no longer hold on. They directly lay down on the ground and started snoring. After all, the rapid march during the day yesterday, coupled with the setting up of artillery at night to bombard the city wall, the sleepiness brought about by fatigue was not something that the refreshing tobacco could resist. At this time, the elite sniffers who were disguised as the leaders of the Sand Bandit Alliance showed their uniqueness. After a long period of strict and professional training, the energy of these sniffers was far beyond that of ordinary people. In order to complete the task, they even did not rest for more than 2 days. In addition, they took time to take a nap to replenish their energy, and they could even last longer. Therefore, these people brought their trusted subordinates, the lucky fellows who had plugs in their ears and eyes to sleep during the bombardment last night, and rode the camel beasts to patrol the camp, acting as guards for the people who were sleeping soundly. The one-eyed man who was holding a brass telescope saw everything. He looked up again and squinted at the eternal blazing sun that was slowly climbing into the sky. "It's a nice day today," the one-eyed man said to himself. "It's a good day for murder and arson." That's right. Upon hearing One-Eye's words, his brother crooked his lips and agreed. After bombing for an entire night, it's time for our young man to fire a few shots. In order to strengthen the defense of the city, the scale of perpetual order had shipped 2 cannons to Spat City 2 days ago, as well as sufficient ammunition. They were the lads that Crooked Mouth had mentioned, and were used to replace the original ballistae. Although there weren't many of them, the quality of the cannons provided by the scale of perpetual order was very good. The cannons were made of 2 kinds of metals, copper and iron. The body of the cannons was also fastened with iron hoops to ensure that they could fire continuously in a short period of time without the risk of the barrel exploding. In addition to the quality of the cannons, a strict and detailed cannon operation instruction manual was also sent along with the cannons, which reflected the high attention paid to the details of preparing the cannons for battle. The gunpowder was loaded into the barrel, and then a wooden or sheepskin plug was stuffed into the barrel. The plug was then pressed down with an iron rod to ensure that no matter what the situation was, the plug would not fly out of the barrel except for the impact of the gunpowder explosion. Then, the cannoneers carried the stone shells covered with iron sheets to the front of the cannon and carefully loaded them into the barrel. The shells were designed to match the barrel, and the polished caliber was quite neat and close to seamless. The cannoneers who fired the cannons had undergone simple training. Although they were not as skilled as the cannoneers, with a marking set in advance and the code drawn in advance to aim, at least there would not be too much deviation. Then, through the use of wooden wedges to adjust the elevation angle of the cannons, a huge wooden beam was used to place the cannons in place, and at the same time, stones were used to press the wooden beam to absorb the excess recoil. This way, the impact of the explosion and the violent recoil would not cause the cannon to deviate from the correct position and cause the shot to miss. Finally, the bags of gunpowder were filled into the muzzle, and the shooting preparations were all complete. Adjust the elements, fire. Watching the successful completion of the firing process, Crooked Mouth excitedly curled his big mouth and ordered excitedly. Accompanied by a rumbling sound, the cannon ignited and produced a huge thrust that pushed the ammunition out of the barrel. Thick smoke floated out of the muzzle, and the friction between the iron sheet on the stone shell and the barrel produced a flash of fire. The temperature increased and softened, and after hitting the target, it was easier to splash in all directions to cause damage to the surrounding enemies. The shocking sound woke up most of the bandits who were resting outside the city. Even if some of them thought that it was the power of their own cannons and did not want to pay attention to it, the subsequent screams of their companions still woke them up from their sleep. Just in time, seeing that some of his subordinates were blown to pieces by the cannonballs fired from Spat City, a cold light flashed in the eyes of the bandit leader. He thought to himself, "Just in time, I don't have to waste my breath. I just need to. What are you scum waiting for? Are you waiting for them to put their machetes to your necks? Hurry up and get up." The bandit leader suddenly roared and kept smashing the heads of his panicked subordinates with the back of his machete. "What are you afraid of? Can't you tell? They only have 2 cannons. Rush up the city wall, and the cannons will be useless when they get close. What are you waiting for? Are your wallets bulging? Or do you think that the lords in the city will take the initiative to reward you?" After saying that, the bandit leader rushed towards Spat City alone. Seeing that their leader was leading the charge, most of his subordinates were encouraged. They let out a cry of confusion and followed suit. Seeing this, the other members of the Sand Bandit Alliance also became ferocious. They pulled out their weapons and charged towards Spat City. However, they did not notice that the leader who rushed out first was getting slower and slower. As he ran, he fell from the first echelon to the back of the formation. The ladder that the carpenters had hurriedly made came in handy at this time. There were specialized bandits carrying it toward the city wall. When the ladder reached the top of the city wall, the bandits at the front began to howl as they climbed up the city wall. Iron javelins with stabilizing fins, arrows, and stones poured down like rain on the enemies who were trying to climb up the wall. All kinds of noises suddenly rang out. Swords and sabers collided fiercely against shields, producing crisp sounds. Blades cut throats, arrowheads pierced chests, and stones smashed skulls. Of course, there was never a lack of wails from the injured on the battlefield. Chapter 341. Many things needed to be prepared for a siege. Various types and forms of tortoiseshell spikes, movable wooden towers, different forms of ladders, different tools needed to dig different types of walls, and it was best to have a mage to cast spells from the back. However, the Sand Bandit Alliance only had crude ladders and cheap human lives. The soldiers formed by the bandits each had the responsibility of cavalry and infantry, archers and lancers, armorers, cannoneers, raiding light cavalry, and tunnel engineers. They were all versatile, but none of them were professionals. Although the walls of Spat City were not very tall, and the core of the defense system was still an ordinary wall, the thick walls were made of concrete. Then, large blocks of limestone were placed on the outside, and bricks were inserted to make the whole structure more solid. The battle platform at the top of the city wall was protected by the battlements, and there were stairs from below to the platform at the top. There were also several towers scattered around. According to the Medici's habit of building towers, these towers were not connected to the city wall. This way, the towers and the city wall could be stabilized and not collapse. It was precisely because of this that the bandits, who were struggling to climb the ladder, had to endure attacks from both the sides and the top of their heads. Many soldiers were hiding in the battle platform of the tower, shooting arrows at the enemy from the shooting holes. For the sake of their own lives, many bandits had no choice but to pick up the shields of their companions that had fallen from the arrows. They tied the shields around their bodies before they dared to continue climbing. At the same time, they had to carefully block the falling rocks. As for the legendary defensive magic weapons, golden soup and hot oil, because the former was too dirty and the latter was too expensive, the two brothers, crooked mouth and one-eyed, did not let the defenders prepare in advance. They had better choices, and killing the enemy was more efficient. Of course, these choices were also provided by the scales of Eternal Order. When the Sand Rhino Caravan sent the two cannons, they also sent some special defensive equipment that could spray flammable solution to burn the enemy. The solution was packed in small buckets. When it was used, one only needed to open the lid, put the bucket in the slot reserved on the machine, and then manually press the spraying device, and it would be able to operate smoothly. The core ingredient of the solution was black oil produced near Nome, mixed with powdered resin to give it adhesiveness. The production cost was not too high, and there were hundreds of small barrels delivered. According to the estimation of the technician in charge of installing the equipment, this batch of solution could last all the equipment for about 4 hourglasses if it was sprayed continuously. Moreover, this was not the time it could cause damage. Due to the viscosity of the solution, it could adhere to the enemy's clothes and armor after being sprayed out. Once ignited, it could burn for a long time. In this regard, the bandits who were besieging the city immediately understood. Many of them had just climbed to the top of the city wall and waved their weapons in an attempt to cut down 1 or 2 defenders. However, before they could stand firm, they were blasted in the chest by the fire dragons that shot out from the tower. At this time, the guards who were originally on the city wall had already retreated from their positions. They put down the iron fences used to seal the city and stood guard in the tower. The empty space at the top of the city wall had already turned into a sea of fire. Even the air had begun to twist and become scorching hot. Following a series of splashes, the rather laughable sound of oil being sprayed rang out. It was as if the flames had formed into a railing that blocked all the invaders. The worst thing was that when the flames hit their bodies, they would immediately burst into cries and screams. The sticky solution was very difficult to wipe off. Once it was ignited and came into contact with a person's skin, it would turn into a greedy, venomous snake that would not stop until it had burned to the bone marrow. As long as the flames touched their armor, the bandits could only quickly take off their armor. However, they would immediately be targeted by the archers hiding in the tower. If they did not take off their armor, the flames would burn through their armor and lick their skin. Some people opened the water pouch at their waist and tried to use water to extinguish the flames, but it was to no avail. It was even more dangerous to hit them carelessly. That could easily turn them into a torch. The best solution was to use sand to cover the flames and extinguish them. However, how could there be so much sand on the city wall? Some smart people quickly came up with a solution. They climbed down the ladder. Some people even felt that the city wall was not too high and simply jumped down from the top of the city wall. The originally chaotic siege battle immediately became even more chaotic because of the return of this group of people. In some corners of the battlefield, there were situations where people from the gangs who were already at odds with each other pulled out their swords and started to fight with each other. What a bunch of useless people, the bandit leader snorted coldly. He thought fiercely in his heart. It's fine if they are burned to death, but they will actually affect the progress of the siege later. The commander is right. If you want to do something well, you have to do it yourself. After thinking for a while, the veteran sniffer immediately came up with a solution. He pulled out his scimitar and waved it in the air. Supervisor team, come out. Go and suppress those ungrateful people. Immediately, a group of elite bandits riding on six-legged warhorses rushed out from behind him. They wore the same style of mail armor and held scimitars in their hands as they rushed towards the chaotic battlefield. As long as there was resistance, no matter which gang they belonged to, the supervisor team would treat them equally. Even if they didn't dare to resist, they would still be whipped a few times in the face. Although the supervisor team's behavior was barbaric, it was indeed very effective. Soon, the chaos gradually subsided. At this time, the bandit leader also made his own preparations. He ordered people to dig up river mud from the Nero River not far away and smeared it thickly on his cloak. He wanted to use this method to resist the flame spray. Many of the gang leaders who were disguised as sniffers did the same. In addition to some of his trusted subordinates, the bandit leader led dozens of elite backbones and personally braved the arrows and stones to climb the ladder to attack the city. When they reached the top of the city wall, the smell of roasted meat was the first to reach their nostrils. They resisted the urge to vomit and placed the soles of their feet on the hot brick ground. They quickly charged in the direction of the tower. The fire dragon arrived as expected. The bandit leader raised his cloak and used the mud on it to block the flame. The mud quickly dried, cracked, and even the surface of the mud was pottery. However, it did indeed block the sticky flame outside the cloak. Except for a few unlucky fellows, because the mud on their cloaks was burned by the flame, they had no choice but to turn into human torches in their own wails. Hurry up and rush to the tower. The dry mud can help you block the rain of arrows. As long as they could rush there, the bandit leader was very confident that he could use the scimitar in his hand that was enchanted with a sharp spell to break the iron fence in one fell swoop and rush in to kill the guards, buying some time for the other bandits below the city wall to occupy the top of the city wall. Chapter 342. The walls of Spat City were only about 20 feet high, but the towers were at least twice as tall. The towers, which cut the city wall into sections, served as the second line of defense for the defenders. The wooden stairs that connected to the ground on the city wall had been removed, and below them stood rows of archers with rapid-fire short bows in their hands. Since the platforms on the city wall were occupied by the enemy, the archers could freely shoot up and rain arrows without worrying about accidentally injuring their allies. The platforms on the city wall were about 3 yards wide and could only accommodate 6 or 7 enemies side by side. At this time, they were all attacking the towers. The soldiers who were guarding the city wall were gathered there, ready to engage the enemy at close range. Of course, the gates of each tower were sealed by iron fences. If they wanted to break in, they had to lift them up again. Otherwise, even if they managed to get close to the towers, they could only watch the fences and sigh. At the same time, they had to endure the spears and arrows that came out of nowhere. The only good thing for the bandits was that, due to the angle of the machinery, as long as they were close to the towers, the flamethrowers installed at the top of the towers would no longer be a threat to them. As for how to break through the iron fences, the bandit leader naturally had his own plan since he dared to lead his troops to this place. This man, who was one of the top 3 in terms of personal strength in the entire sniffer unit, had an enchanted weapon with a sharpening spell. He was confident that, as long as the iron fences were not made of special metals, which was impossible in most cases, those precious materials would not be wasted on making an iron fence. As he expected, after a series of clattering noises and splashing sparks, the iron fence that divided the platform and the tower into 2 was soon broken into a large hole that could allow 2 people to barge in at the same time. Rush in and get those lazy bastards to climb up quickly, the bandit leader shouted excitedly as he passed on the order to his men. Seize the tower and go down the stairs of the tower. There are only a bunch of archers left in the city. Break their formation. Like a string of cannons, the bandit leader gave orders one after another. However, he had to admit that if the war went according to his plan, it wouldn't take long for Spat City to fall. The cannons and ammunition outside the city can be saved, the bandit leader thought to himself with an imperceptible smile on his face. As long as we can control Spat City, the commander will have one more bargaining chip in the negotiations. He made up his mind to occupy this section of the city wall as soon as possible so that the bandits and the defenders could fight each other until both sides suffered heavy losses. I can't let those scumbags have too much energy left. Otherwise, the citizens of Sparut will suffer. In order to complete his strategy, he had to work harder. At present, he had already taken down a tower. He wanted to use this tower as a stronghold to fight for some space for himself, so that he could rush to the front of another tower. With another ping, 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 ping sound, he estimated that he would be able to take down another tower. I have to get rid of all these towers as soon as possible so that this battle can be considered stable. Otherwise, it's hard to say whether the commander of the garrison will have other plans. Thinking of this, the bandit leader once again took the lead and rushed into the tower in front of him. He wanted to kill his way out. However, after a few breaths of time after he stepped into the tower, his whole body began to sweat profusely, and his pupils dilated a little. Oh no, we've been tricked. It turned out that the one-eyed and crooked brothers had already set up an illusion array in the tower. The destruction of the iron fence was the only trigger for this array. When the bandit leader broke into the tower, he wanted to rush to the opposite exit. However, no matter how he ran, he seemed to be walking on the same spot. There was no way for him to get close to his target. What made him even more terrified was that in the process of moving forward, not only would he occasionally hit a wall, but there would also be scimitars and spears that flashed with cold light from time to time. If it weren't for his nimbleness, his life would have been in danger. However, in the face of the swords and sabers that came out of nowhere, he had no other way to deal with them other than to defend himself with all his might. In fact, this level of illusion was not profound at all. They were all warriors, but if it were a member of Keys's team, whether it was the sacred warrior Jensen, who could use his holy power to directly annihilate the illusion array, or the desert elf Brock, who could sense everything around him with just sound, this illusion array was really not enough. It was a pity that the bandit leader was not that strong. Thus, he quickly received his own bento. With a swoosh, a spear pierced from behind. The bandit leader, who was still holding other weapons, did not notice, and the spear pierced into his armpit. Because there was no armor in that area, after being pierced, the soldier holding the spear exerted a little force. With a splat, the spear pierced into the bandit leader's torso and pierced through his heart. At this time, a big hand came out from deep. Before the bandit leader collapsed to the ground, the hand knocked away his headscarf and grabbed his hairbun on top of his head. A scimitar with cold light suddenly appeared and mercilessly separated the bandit leader's head from his body. Hang this head on top of the city wall. The person who spoke was the commander of the Spat City's garrison, One Eye. He had been observing the enemy with brass binoculars, so he recognized the face of the bandit leader. In addition, as a great senior in this industry, One Eye naturally knew how to intimidate the gangsters. The bloody head was the best warning, so there was the scene of beheading in public. As it turned out, a great senior was indeed a great senior. One Eye's previous experience was quickly verified when the bandit leader, as well as the other confidants and comrades who had followed him in the attack, the person who heard the news disguised as the gang leader, their heads were hung one by one on the city wall of Spat. The originally arrogant bandit alliance collapsed in an instant. The bandits who had yet to climb the wall immediately turned around and ran back. They wanted to run back to the camp to find their mounts and escape from this dangerous place immediately. However, they were ambushed on the way. While One Eye was guarding the city wall, his brother Crooked Mouth led a team of soldiers on six-legged warhorses and secretly came out from the side door of Spat City under the cover of illusion. They had already lined up neatly. Spears ready. Cavalry, charge. Hearing the order, the knights on horseback immediately leveled the spears in their hands. They stepped on the stirrups and began to clamp their mounts tightly, giving the six-legged war horses the order to speed up. The illusion used to conceal the cavalry suddenly lost its effect as the horses moved. The charging cavalry in a long snake formation suddenly appeared in the eyes of the fleeing bandits. One side was charging, the other side was tired and panicked. One side was charging cavalry, and the other side was fleeing infantry. There was no suspense in the result. feeling the light of the eternal blazing sun gradually rising into the sky. One Eye stood at the top of the tower and held the battlements. He could not help but sigh. Today is a good day to kill. The sun is full, and the blood will soon be burned dry. Just as he was sighing with emotion, his single eye suddenly rolled up, and he stared at the patrolling eagles circling in the sky with a trace of killing intent. You better fly faster. I really hope that Commander Wenfeng will receive this good news as soon as possible. Chapter 343. Plaster pits that were slightly burning spewed out thick smoke. Hammers clanked in the warm atmosphere. People shouted from time to time. Construction went on day and night. Torches burned until late into the night. The city walls surrounded by wooden scaffolding were rising at an alarming speed. Summer had quietly arrived in Gnome City, where the construction site was located. Wisteria and brambles were blooming on the forested hillsides. The flowers on the toadstools were like white stars. In the quiet night, when the moon shone through the glistening aqueduct, nightingales sang in the pines. Standing in the consul's meeting hall, Commander Wenfeng and the others had been staying here ever since they arrived at Nome. However, no one had come to greet them. They were not allowed to leave even if they wanted to. His brows were furrowed as he looked at the construction site in the distance. It was not until a patrolling eagle flew over the horizon like a bat in the night that Commander Wenfeng snapped out of his daze. He fed the dried meat to the tired messenger and stroked its feathers before letting it go. At that moment, a small wooden cylinder appeared in Commander Wenfeng's hand. He gently pulled it out from the side. The top cover fell off. A folded piece of paper inside the wooden cylinder was brought out and landed lightly in Commander Wenfeng's hand. Quicksand is dead. The siege of Spat City has failed. The Desert Bandit Alliance has been wiped out. The fine handwriting briefly described the events of the Sand Bandit Alliance's defeat in Spat City. Among them, Quicksand referred to the one who became the leader of the bandits. His death meant that Commander Wenfeng's secret move had come to an end. Normally, Commander Wenfeng would most likely review the plan. However, he did not have the time now, not only because of the content of the negotiation, but also because the target of the negotiation was not willing to give him time to think. With a muffled bang, the door to the meeting hall of Consul Gnome's residence was pushed open. An oversized ogre walked in first. Seeing Commander Wenfeng and the others waiting there, the ogre let out a cold snort. Treacherous little people, your plan has been exposed. If we can't get past you, and you. Holding the ebony chain, the burly ogre man's loud voice echoed in the council hall. You'll all be smashed into minced meat. Before he finished speaking, the people who came with Commander Wenfeng all became nervous. They all stood in front of the commander and took out all kinds of equipment from their bodies. A belt that could turn into a straight blade with a slight shake. A leather shield that was cleverly folded and hidden under the ornaments of their cloaks. A small crossbow that could be flicked open with a tap of the arm guard. A green arrow tip that was obviously dipped in poison in advance. Their reactions were swift, but little did they know that the ogre Neru was sneering in his heart. A trace of contempt flashed in his eyes. Oh, you came to the consul's meeting hall and brought weapons without permission. You were checked in advance and were still hidden? Where's the law enforcement team? Nalu roared. Dozens of armed kobold warriors of the Dragonborn clan immediately poured into the council hall. They were all wearing the fanatic armor. In addition to the machetes in their hands, they also carried shields made of fine iron. They stared at Commander Wenfeng and the others, waiting for the other party to resist. They would swarm up and chop them into mincemeat. Put down your little props. When Commander Wenfeng saw the situation, he immediately pushed away his men in front of him and defined the weapons in their hands as a bunch of harmless little toys. Followers of the Megalosaurus Pasha, please exercise restraint. You are here for the ransom. A voice mixed with the sound of gears grinding and steam spewing sounded outside the door. The steampunk half-lich walked into the council hall. Don't use the word peace. Your actions have tarnished this word. Commander Wenfeng was not angry when he was confronted. Instead, he felt relieved that the other party appeared in front of him. As long as he could negotiate, he had the opportunity to get the wealth he needed without shedding a drop of blood. An honest man's life is never easy. Easy days are always built on the pain of many people. Commander Wenfeng used a Medic proverb as his opening remarks. As expected, he received a burst of ridicule, but the spy chief did not feel discouraged at all. To be honest, I don't completely agree with the behavior of the Great Vader, but for his goal, to make the majority of people in the Ash world no longer suffer, ordinary people may not understand, but as a legendary spellcaster, you should know that although it may not matter to you, it is the whole meaning of my life, and it is worth all my efforts. He bore the stare from the half-lich with his eyes and did not waver at all. As he said, Snader did have doubts about the behavior of the Great Vader. From the many messages sent by Commander Wenfeng, he learned that the other party wanted to ask for ransom. He combined some of the known situations and made his own guess. But now, Commander Wenfeng actually dared to openly poke holes in this layer of window paper right in front of him. This could not help but arouse the half-lich's curiosity. Is the experiment he is doing related to the purification of mortal souls in the Ash world? The Ash world is a world abandoned by the gods. The mortals living here do not have the habit of believing in the gods. Their souls do not even have the chance to be hung on the wall of the faithless. They can only wander in the material plane. In order to save this gradually withering world, the ancient soul-binding mages built soul-binding towers, attracting the souls of all the mortals after death to gather in these mage towers. Then, they used the lava of the Earth's core to melt them and use them to feed this world. In a sense, the mortals born in this world are much more unfortunate than the residents of other places in the multiverse. Their lives are more difficult. Not only do they have to spend their lives in the desert, but even after death, it is difficult to rest in peace. As the reincarnation of the soul-binding mage Shurik, every time I go to the soul-binding tower to deal with the soul blockage, I can hear the painful wails of the soul being burned by the Earth's core fire. What makes me even more afraid is that this self-saving method of the Ash world from ancient times is now slowly losing its effectiveness. Over the past 300 years, more and more soul blockages have occurred, and the situation is getting worse each time. In order to solve this problem, through 200 years of research, I invented a unique spell that can transform the light emitted by the eternal blaze for my own use. This inexhaustible energy, if used on a large scale, can not only solve the problem of the soul blockage in the soul-binding tower, but also bring sufficient energy to the Ash world, and everyone can benefit from it. But transforming this energy requires a medium, and only by refining gold into blazing crystals can it be done. According to my estimation, to make enough blazing crystals, I need a huge amount of gold. So, more than 100 years ago, I started. Standing in the underground laboratory of the museum, the Grand Vexel revealed his inner thoughts to his trusted subordinates, the chief of the Fire Dwarf clan and the general on duty, and answered the questions that had been in their minds for many years. Keys, who was sealed in the alchemy amber, heard all these words. Chapter 344. As night fell, the gray stones of the port of Bite City were covered with a faint golden-orange color. The setting sun dyed the sea blood-red with the last trace of afterglow, and finally melted into the horizon. The tide lapped the embankment of the port, and seagulls flocked back to their nests. However, the port, which used to be bustling with activity, seemed to be empty at this time. It was frighteningly strange. Perhaps there was at least a group of people. They all stayed near the anchorage, but they were all waiting quietly in the guard post of the port. Many of them were responsible for looking after the guards and dock workers who were temporarily grounded here. Boss, who are those people? Why are they so resourceful? Even the captain of the guards at the port nodded and bowed to them. Shut up. Watch your tongue. Don't ask what you shouldn't ask. Most of the dock workers who made a living in Bite City had their own organizations. Among them, there were foremen who were responsible for arranging work for the workers and negotiating with the owners of the merchant ships that needed to unload and load goods for payment. But now, these foremen had received a notice that the commander of the guards at the port had asked them to restrain their subordinates and not be too curious. At the same time, everything that happened here this evening had to be kept in their stomachs. Otherwise, they would definitely suffer. Not only the workers at the port, but in the afternoon, someone came to inform the owners of the ships docked at the port to bring all their sailors ashore. Whether it was a dinner party or a social gathering, they had to return after 4 hourglasses. Some ship owners who didn't know the reason were too lazy to pay attention to this notice. But about an hourglass before the martial law was imposed, they were all visited by the day watchmen under the command of the Grand Vader. Naturally, they immediately expressed their firm obedience. There was nothing they could do even if they didn't obey. The elite soldiers boarded every ship, the bottom floor of Class A, the cabins filled with ballast, and even the wooden buckets filled with clean water were open for inspection. As long as someone was found to be hiding, these people would immediately be escorted to an unknown prison, and the ship owners would immediately receive a list of fines and confiscations, making their wallets cleaner than their faces. The reason for such a move was that 2 important ships would arrive in Bite City today. It was unknown whether it was out of curiosity about the Grand Vader's experiment or because of Commander Wenfeng's astonishing eloquence, but the steampunk derelict that was temporarily in charge of Gnome City agreed to pay the ransom. Of course, this sum of money was not directly obtained from the scale of Perpetual Order. Instead, Snade had used his factory in Gnome City as collateral to obtain a loan from the Chamber of Commerce in exchange for 33 million silver cats worth of gold. In order not to arouse the attention of the public, this batch of gold was not transported by airship. Instead, it was transported to the port of Bite City by water through the Nero River. Snader boarded the ship himself to ensure the safety of the voyage. As ransom, the gold would be split between 2 ships. According to the agreement, after the gold on the first ship was delivered, the Grand Weasel would release keys. After Snade confirmed it in person, the second ship would sail into Bite Harbor. "General, the ship is here." The messenger who had been staring at the entrance of the fjord saw the pale blue light emitted by the whale oil beacon fire and immediately ran over to report to the clan general on duty. "Our brothers sent a signal. They have boarded the ship and completed the inspection. Everything is normal." Hearing his subordinate's report, the clan general on duty nodded. In fact, other than him, the other members of the Day Watch unit did not know that this operation, accepting a large amount of gold, was actually to collect raw materials for the Grand Weasel's magic experiments. But this did not affect their enthusiasm for their work. Almost at the same time when they received the news that the gold ship had sailed into the fjord, the entire Bite Harbor instantly became brightly lit. Teams of Day Watch unit members held torches wrapped in tar and patrolled the vicinity of the harbor to prevent any oversights. As the gold ship docked at the berth, the ship's side came into contact with the cork pad at the edge of the harbor, making a creaking sound. 10 wide-tailed carriages had been waiting at the anchorage for a long time. The locked carriages had been opened and were lined up in a line, waiting for the cargo to be loaded. The coachmen and porters were all Day Watch unit members who had been waiting here for a long time. Originally, a ship of gold, even if part of it was unrefined gold sand, 10 wide-tailed carriages were too much to transport. However, according to the regulations, the transportation of such valuable goods had to go through a lottery before loading. Only a portion of the carriages would be loaded with the truly valuable goods. The other carriages would be loaded with heavy ballast stones or sandbags. This way, all the carriages would set off at the same time. No one would know in advance which carriage was loaded with the truly valuable goods. This could serve as a precaution against possible robberies. Of course, with the Day Watch unit escorting them and the Fire Dwarf warriors of the Pickaxe clan providing support along the way, as well as the Grand Weasel's ability to teleport to the location of the carriages at any time, the safety factor of this gold transport couldn't be any higher. But even so, rules were rules. The Day Watch unit still strictly carried out the tradition that had been passed down for many years. "General, the brothers are ready." The herald ran over to report again. At this moment, the Day Watch unit general was standing beside the wide-tailed carriage. He wanted to personally participate in the escort of the gold, board the ship, and unload the cargo. With a single order, everyone began to get busy. With a clang, considering the weight of the cargo. A thickened gangway made of sturdy wood was placed on the side of the gold ship. They could have used scaffolding and hanging baskets to lift the cargo to the dock, but for safety's sake, the day watch unit general still sent people to board the ship and carry the gold boxes or wooden buckets filled with golden sand down one by one. Previously, at the entrance of the fjord, although there were already people on board the ship for inspection and had followed the gold ship to the dock, they were only responsible for checking if there were any safety hazards on the ship. They didn't open the boxes to inspect the goods. Now, there were a few high-level smelters from the Pickaxe clan boarding the ship. These fire dwarves, who had been working with metal all year round and whose bodies were even forged from metal, could easily distinguish the quality of gold. That's right, this golden sand has been roughly refined, so the gold content is very high. A fire dwarf opened bucket after bucket of golden sand and reached his palm into it. He grabbed a bit of golden sand powder at different depths and put it into his mouth. The total amount is also no different from what was written on the previous list. His companions were currently inspecting the refined gold bricks. They randomly pulled out some of the gold bricks, took out hammers and anvils, and gently hammered them into the shape of a cube. Then, they used an instrument to measure the mass of the golden cube. There's no problem with the ductility. The density value is also consistent with the records left behind by the clan. It's indeed gold. Chapter 345. On the first gold ship, the person in charge of the scale of perpetual order was none other than the fat merchant, Santos. He was currently the senior manager of the Chamber of Commerce and also the representative of this transaction. He was in charge of welcoming the young blue dragon back. Of course, rather than calling a return, it was better to call it a release. According to the contract previously signed, the contract for the payment of ransom for the scale of perpetual order, which was brought to Nome by Commander Wenfeng and signed by the Grand Vader, and under the witness of many great beings, the Grand Vader must immediately release the young blue dragon after receiving half of the ransom. At the same time, the Grand Vader must not use any form of magical means, including but not limited to trapping, tracking, poisoning, and other malicious acts of breach of the contract. As the first witness of the contract, Santos was also protected by the contract. Before the final delivery was completed, no one on the Grand Vader's side could harm him, and even when he was faced with other malicious acts, he would have to do his best to protect him. But even knowing these terms, the fat merchant was still a little nervous at the moment. If anyone used spell sight to spy on him, they would find that Santos was already wrapped in colorful magical aura. In addition to some magical items that he usually bought and collected, he also used his authority as a senior manager to temporarily rent no less than 10 treasures from the scale of perpetual order as a last resort to protect his life. I am the witness of the contract to welcome the Megalosaurus Pasha. Although a little timid, as a qualified merchant, Santos still mustered the courage to announce loudly to the day watchman who had boarded the ship. Now, you have checked the gold I brought. According to the contract, unless the Megalosaurus Pasha is sent to this ship, you have no right to take away even a grain of gold. Hearing this warning in a trembling voice, some of the day watchmen sneered in disdain, but were immediately stopped by their officers. They all knew of the existence of the contract and the binding force it had on the Grand Vader. Witness of the agreement, please wait patiently. I can guarantee that none of my subordinates will attempt to breach the agreement. A day watchman dressed as an officer walked out of the crowd and stopped in front of the fat merchant who was blocking the gangway. With the help of the crackling torches, Santos could tell from his uniform that he was a day watchman's field officer. As for the Megalosaurus Pasha, he will be sent over immediately. Once he's boarded the ship, we'll start moving the ransom. With the assurance of the senior officer, Santos's heart sank a little. Please do as soon as possible. Not long after, a closed door of a warehouse near the anchorage opened, and a carriage with a wide tail, pulled by 4 six-legged horses, drove out. Although the speed was not fast, it was stable, and it arrived in front of the berth in a few dozen breaths. The coachman jumped off the carriage and came to the front of the door. He held the key in his hand and chanted a spell. Then, With a click, the magic chain that was tied to the door of the wide carriage was automatically unlocked. This driver turned out to be a powerful spellcaster. In order to ensure a smooth handover and prevent any accidents, the Grand Vader had raised the security level of the blue dragon trapped in the alchemy amber to the highest level. The driver waved his hand again, and magic waves swept through the interior of the carriage. The traps arranged in the carriage were removed one by one. Then, the flying carpet that was originally laid on the floor of the carriage slowly rose into the air, carrying a large piece of alchemy amber to the gold ship. When the flying carpet floated to the deck, the entourage of the Scale of Perpetual Order immediately swarmed forward. Some of them were responsible for guarding, so they held swords and sabers to separate the alchemy amber crystal from the Day Watchman. Some were responsible for rescuing the young blue dragon. Some took out enchanted tools and fiercely chiseled at the alchemy amber crystal, while others took out a special solution to try to dissolve the alchemy amber crystal. No one tried to cast spells, because on the night Keys was captured, the Demolixnator had tried many spells when rescuing him. He had already verified that the alchemy amber crystal had an amazing resistance to all known spells. If a legendary level Demolic was like this, ordinary spellcasters would definitely not be able to use spells to break the imprisonment. But no matter how hard these people tried, the alchemy amber crystal seemed to have been added with an indestructible characteristic, and there was no damage at all. Everyone could see the young blue dragon trapped in it, but there was no way to rescue him. "What's going on?" Santos asked in an unfriendly tone. However, he could only see a nonchalant expression on the face of the Day Watchman beside him. It was precisely because of this that he felt particularly displeased. "Are you going to violate the signed contract?" The contract clearly states, release the Megalosaurus Pasha, and not release the Megalosaurus Pasha with imprisonment. Faced with the question, the Day Watchman just smiled. He took out a handful of powder from his arms and sprinkled it on the torch held by the Day Watchman beside him. The flame instantly turned crimson. The Day Watchman, who was watching from afar on the shore, immediately received the signal. He waved his hand and led his men to line up in a neat formation, walking towards the gold ship at an extremely fast speed. Witness the performance of the contract. After finishing his work, the Day Watchman nodded slightly to Santos. He had obviously prepared a script for the fat merchant's question. It's true that release the Megalosaurus Pasha, but this time was after the second gold ship arrived, and we received the gold. At that time, this amber sculpture will definitely be outside the fjords, on the ship you have prepared. The dissolving solution prepared by His Excellency, the Great Dimensional, will be sent there at the same time as the gold is received. You will personally release the Megalosaurus Pasha. Although each word was a little unreasonable, it did not violate the requirements of the contract. Although Santos was indignant, he had no choice but to swallow his anger. Hurry up and move. The contract has a time limit. If you don't fulfill the contract by the time, your great Vader will suffer unimaginable punishment. Perhaps he was really infuriated by the other party, but the fat merchant rarely said such harsh words. Under the dim light of the torch, the Day Watchman's face turned a little green. His Adam's apple moved, and an imperceptible chill appeared in his eyes. But soon, these abnormalities were suppressed by his muscles. "Please don't worry. We will finish the work soon." At the same time, the young blue dragon in the crystal of the alchemy amber said the same words in his heart. Although the exterior of the alchemy amber was still extremely hard, the internal structure had already turned into a liquid, leaving only a layer of hard shell wrapped around the outside. Chapter 346. Perhaps, as many fables said, adversity was the best tool to temper people. After being ambushed and imprisoned in the alchemy amber, Keys had gained something new. It was still his innate adaptive ability that had taken effect. Due to the devouring of the camel god's divine power, his adaptive ability had changed from passive to active. The young blue dragon constantly spat out weak energy to cut off some amber powder, and when he swallowed the powder, he evolved into a brand new ability. In addition to the cone-shaped force field, lightning, flames, and weakening breath, Keyes had mastered a brand new breath. He had evolved an organ that could secrete a solution similar to alchemy amber. Although he had not tried the true effect of this breath, just by mixing it with his saliva and spitting it out, he could gradually melt the alchemy amber crystal that imprisoned him. The principle was probably based on the principle of similar dissolving. Keyes came to his own conclusion after a little analysis. In addition, he had evolved the ability to survive in an oxygen-free environment. Under the threat of death, he persisted in his jailbreak work every day. Of course, mastering a new ability was a good thing, but to use this ability, the young blue dragon had to awkwardly soak in his own saliva, even though the dissolved alchemy amber solution actually only contained a small amount of saliva. "I will definitely make you pay." Keyes, who was restrained, kept roaring in his heart, and he did not stop melting the alchemy amber at all, even though the day watchman officer had promised that when they received the second batch of ransom, they would send the dissolved solution to the ship. Of course, Keyes was not that naive. During the days he was temporarily imprisoned in the Grand Dimensional Laboratory, he had witnessed the entire process of the other party turning gold into blazing crystals. With that kind of efficiency, the gold sent by the scales of eternal order would only delay him by about half an hourglass. Although the Grand Vader claimed to all insiders that the blazing sun crystal was only an important media material that could absorb and store the light emitted from the eternal blazing sun to provide energy for the normal operation of the Ash world. The Grand Vader had told them that the blazing sun crystal was only an important media material that could absorb and store the light emitted from the eternal blazing sun to provide energy for the normal operation of the Ash world. However, the young blue dragon had witnessed the power of the blazing sun crystal twice, during the ambush and when he killed Kanini. Keyes was 70% sure that when the Grand Vader completed the final blazing crystal, he would be the undisputed strongest person on this plane. The underground pyramid, which was used to charge the Ash world, might immediately pop out a AoE cannon that ignored distance, find his position, and blow him up until there was nothing left. Of course, the prerequisite for such an outcome was that the Grand Vader could complete his experiment and successfully seize the authority and power of the Eternal Blaze. However, since he had already predicted this, how could Keyes not be prepared in advance? Although the young blue dragon had always been loyal to his heart, he was also very clear about the saying, "You can only be a thief for 1,000 days, but not a thief for 1,000 days." Even if he was willing to give up everything in the Ash world and never set foot in this world again, the Great Vader might use other schemes or simply find his hiding place and kill him. Therefore, instead of waiting passively, it was better to take the initiative. In the underground laboratory in the lagoon, not long after the seal and the alchemy amber crystal loosened, Keyes tried to project his spirit crystal servant. Because the spirit crystal servant did not exist in a physical form, but was a manifestation of psionic abilities, it could ignore most obstacles in the multiverse and freely project to any other party within the range of its owner's psionic power. The Grand Vader's alchemy amber was indeed unique. After it became a solid crystal, not only was it as hard as diamond, it also had a great suppressive effect on spells and psionic abilities. However, after the alchemy amber became liquid, apart from being extremely sticky, its other special properties were weakened to varying degrees. In particular, its suppressive effect on psionic abilities became almost defenseless. Through his unremitting efforts, Keyes' psionic ability finally pierced through the thin outer layer of the alchemy amber crystal and successfully projected his spirit crystal servant, hiding it in the Grand Vader's underground laboratory. At this time, all he needed to do was wait quietly. Once the Grand Vader received the gold, he would most likely immediately transform it into a blazing sun crystal and then install the blazing sun crystal into the pyramid-shaped magical item. This judgment was based on the fact that the trapped Keyes had seen the #1 spellcaster of Medici practice the installation process many times. He clearly wanted to improve his proficiency. However, according to the young blue dragon's observations, the Grand Vader would pause for at least a few dozen breaths during each practice. He had to continuously recite incantations to rest and reorganize his spells. Not only that, but after completing the practice, the Grand Vader would also have a short period of exhaustion and physical exhaustion. He had to immediately take a secret medicine that he personally concocted to quickly restore his physical strength and energy. This period was undoubtedly a period of weakness for him. If he were to launch a sneak attack at that time, Keyes reckoned that he would have the confidence to overturn his opponent, or at least seriously injure him. The young blue dragon left behind a spirit crystal servant. While hiding himself well, he could also monitor the Grand Vader's underground laboratory. As long as he waited for the right time, Keyes would be able to use his psionic powers to swap positions with the spirit crystal servant. The cone-shaped force field's breath should be able to destroy the pyramid, Keyes thought to himself. As for the Grand Vader, the newly born amber breath is similar to alchemy amber, so it should also have good magic resistance. It's just right to entertain you. Just as the young blue dragon was still thinking about how he should retaliate, the gold and sand on the first gold transport ship had all been moved to the anchorage by the day watchman. It was unknown what kind of spell was used, but a pitch-black fog instantly enveloped the wide-tailed carriage transporting the gold. By the time the fog dissipated, all the wide-tailed carriages had their doors closed and were firmly bound by enchanted chains. Full speed ahead, set off to the predetermined location, fire signal flares, and use magic communication. The day watchman issued a series of orders, and after the spellcasters released magic fireworks, both to announce their departure and to warn the day watchman at the reception location. 10 wide-tailed carriages, pulled by 4 six-legged warhorses, lined up in a straight line and drove out of the city. At the same time, the gold transport ship, which had been reassembled as cargo, also raised its sails, and the deck below the side of the ship stretched out for acceleration. It quickly rushed to the entrance of the fjord with the Megalosaurus Pasha, who had been welcomed back. The day watchmen, who were responsible for maintaining order at the anchorage, did not stop them. Instead, there were people who drove small boats and lit lanterns to guide the gold transport ship on the correct route. Moreover, these people would soon act as navigators for the second gold transport ship. Chapter 347. Enslaving the body will stimulate the mind to resist. Looking at the day watchers who hurried away in the wide-tailed carriage, wanting to receive the second batch of ransom as soon as possible, the Grand Vader sighed inwardly. But if the mind is enslaved, the body will naturally obey. But soon after, he cleared his mind of these messy thoughts. Instead of thinking about things that had already become an established reality, he was more inclined to imagine the path he would take in the future. Of course, all of this was based on the foundation that the remaining gold was successfully transformed into blazing crystals by him. Only then could he completely grasp the great power of the eternal blaze in the palm of his hand. As for the Shurik's wool hidden in the spirit-bound tower, the only remaining fragment of consciousness of the soul-binding sorcerer, it could no longer lead the Grand Vader, or rather, the current generation of Alan, to choose to reincarnate. For this world, I've already sacrificed 1,000 years without asking for anything in return. I will live for myself for the rest of my life until the next 1,000 years. The Grand Vader's mind, which was originally as calm as an ancient well, suddenly rippled. And even infinitely, as long as the last piece of blazing crystal is refined and placed in the focus tower, my fate will be broken. Although to all the insiders, including his own confidants, he claimed that the focus tower, which was actually a magical item piled up with gold, was built to provide energy for the world of ashes. But in fact, his purpose was to completely get rid of Shurik's restraint on him. The power of the past generations of Alan was completely based on the spirit-bound tower's ability to provide almost infinite soul energy, while being responsible for purifying the souls of the entire world. Compared to the other spellcasters of the Ashes Plane, the Grand Vader might not be the most talented, but he never worried about the lack of obsidian magic beads when casting spells. Even when he used legendary spells, the situation was the same. This was the gift of the ancient soul-binding sorcerer, or rather, the creatures of the entire world to the past generations of Alan. But for the Grand Vader who wanted to get rid of the fate of reincarnation, this gift was also a shackle. However, as long as he could activate the focus tower, he would have found a more abundant source of energy. He would no longer need to follow the invisible contract between him and the spirit binding tower to obtain powerful strength. Not only that, during the 300 years of construction, the Grand Vader slowly realized that the magnificent power of the eternal blaze was far more than just a source of energy for him. If he used it properly, he could even reshape the Ash world according to his own preferences. Creating a world was never something that mortals could do. That is an ability and honor that only the gods can have. Taking a deep breath and calming himself down, the Grand Vader secretly warned himself. So, I have to be careful, and I have to clean up after the matter. I can't leave behind any hidden dangers. Just as he was planning to sort out the remaining loopholes, a signal flare suddenly rose into the sky. Along with the sharp whooshing sound and the dazzling sparks from the fireworks, the neat sound of horse hooves approached from afar. Not long after, someone came to report to the Grand Vader that the second batch of ransom had been safely transported back. It was being loaded into the elevator and piled up into his underground laboratory warehouse. Because he had already revealed part of his plan to the general on duty and the chief of the Fire Dwarves, he did not need to remind them again. Except for Commander Wenfeng, who had not returned as a hostage, 2 of the 3 heroes under the Grand Vader had arrived. They would be responsible for the security work during the conversion of the gold and the assembly of the focus tower. In the warehouse of the underground laboratory, many composite magic circles that had long been engraved were activated at the same time, checking the quality of the gold and detecting if there had been any tampering with it. Soon, the feedback from the magic circles was that everything was normal. Almost at the moment of receiving this message, the Grand Vader was teleported to his laboratory. After reciting a few incantations, the laboratory immediately underwent an earth-shattering change. First, a small defense lock was activated, and a light purple protective barrier enveloped the laboratory tightly. Then, countless invisible servants swarmed out of their nests and rushed to the laboratory's supporting warehouse to move the gold. The Grand Vader himself, on the other hand, used teleportation again and stood at the top of the pyramid, the focus tower. As he chanted loudly, the tip of the pyramid slowly unfolded like petals. One after another, blazing sun crystals extended from the top of the focus tower like stamens. Every sunfire crystal was rotating and adjusting its angle so that the energy stored in it could be gathered at one place. Above the sunfire crystals, a miniature version of Eternal Blaze gradually took shape, drowning the entire underground laboratory in light. Conversion. The Grand Vader cast the last spell, and the miniature version of Eternal Blaze suddenly expanded. A scorching ray of light was shot out and fell on the golden sand that the invisible servants had moved to one place. The ray of light from Eternal Blaze carried unparalleled heat and heat. The gold and sand were immediately turned into puddles of liquid that flowed slowly to the focus tower along the trenches on the ground. The moment the golden liquid came into contact with the tower of focus, it turned into golden snakes and began to climb upwards. The ray of light from the miniature version of Eternal Blaze illuminated them all the time and provided them with energy. Most of the golden snakes began to seep into the tower of focus halfway through their climb. Only 3 of the most tenacious golden snakes persisted to the top of the focus tower and crawled into the stamens of the sunfire crystals, turning into new clusters of crystals. During the whole process, the Grand Vader had to stay close to the miniature version of Eternal Blaze because he had to mobilize energy and chant spells. Under the extremely high temperature, he had to maintain his magic shield all the time. It must be noted that the speed of the magic shield's exhaustion was proportional to the damage it suffered. In order to maintain the magic shield, the Grand Vader could only maintain the output of energy similar to the heat radiation of the miniature version of Eternal Blaze. If it were any other spellcaster from the Ashen world, let alone persevering until the refinement of the blazing crystal was completed, it would only take a few breaths for their spell shields to collapse. Their bodies would be instantly vaporized by the high temperature, and not even ashes would be left. However, the Grand Vader persevered. He completed the last 3 sunfire crystals on the focus tower. All the clusters of crystals began to adjust their angles automatically again, focusing the accumulated energy on the miniature version of Eternal Blaze. Different from the incomplete version, after it was fully formed, the energy was almost no longer dissipated through heat radiation. Even a miniature version of Eternal Blaze began to rotate, and the high temperature in the entire underground laboratory was reabsorbed by it. It's a success. Uncontrollable joy surged out of the Grand Vader's heart. He even forgot to take out the secret potion to recover his energy. As long as it settled, an abrupt change occurred. Chapter 348. Just as the Grand Vader was feeling smug, a sticky liquid poured all over his body. Through the crystal servant, the young blue dragon, who had been spying on the side, retaliated against the #1 spellcaster of Medicus. In a flash, the crystal servant and Keys's body exchanged positions. Thanks to the precious knowledge of the great sage of Giz, the young blue dragon knew this displacement method that could break through the magic lock and magic restriction. Without thinking, Keys used his newly developed ability to spit out amber breath at the Grand Vader. Similar to the alchemy amber solution that imprisoned him before, the liquid sprayed out from the amber breath could also quickly dry and turn into crystals. The Grand Vader, who was wrapped in it, felt Keys's previous encounter, and he could not easily break free of this restraint. Damn reptile! Seeing the young blue dragon start to attack the focus tower with his claws without a word, the Grand Vader cursed in his heart. At the same time, he hardened his heart and triggered the spell engraved in his soul. The amber crystal did have good magic resistance and strong physical strength, but it could not stop the trapped person from moving on the soul level, especially suicidal behavior like self-abandonment. Finding that no matter how he attacked the focus tower with his claws, he could only scratch a few shallow marks on it, Keys was a little annoyed. He began to mobilize his power, ready to give this giant magic object a hard blow. Super electromagnetic. Suddenly, the young blue dragon felt a sudden palpitation, and following his instinct, he quickly tilted his head. With a whoosh, a crossbow arrow shot from the corner of the underground laboratory brushed past his cheek. Although it was only swept by the wind, it still lifted many scales. Quest was well aware of how tough his scales were. Whether it was the large amount of metal he had eaten in his earth-eating life, or the bloodline inheritance of the gold dragon and the power dragon, all of these made his body far stronger than his peers, and his scales were incomparably tough. To be able to lift these scales so easily and ignore the deflection force field on them, it meant that this crossbow arrow was definitely not an ordinary enchanted weapon. Coupled with the looming discomfort after being injured, he even guessed that this might be the legendary dragon-slaying weapon. The truth was so. This crossbow arrow was indeed a divine weapon forged by a cult under the command of a bloodthirsty megalosaurus god. The Grand Vader paid a high price to buy this dragon-slaying crossbow from a plain merchant, and the one who had just used it was the Death Grand Vader. In order to quickly escape from the crystallization of a young blue dragon's amber breath, this contemporary Allen had no choice but to use a secret spell to annihilate his soul. However, since it was a secret spell, it naturally had its own uniqueness. When the soul of an ordinary creature was destroyed, death was the only result. But once the soul of the Grand Vader was destroyed and his body died, the clone hidden in the underground laboratory would automatically be reborn, and his soul would be completely restored. At this moment, the clone of the Grand Vader, or rather, the Grand Vader himself, was wrapped in a robe that he had found at the last minute. However, he was holding a crossbow engraved with complicated patterns in his hand, aiming at the young blue dragon once more. Seeing the sudden appearance of the Grand Vader and feeling the lifeless body in the amber crystal, Keyes was so shocked that his pupils dilated. But he quickly guessed some problems. This should be the same as the previous encounter with Lilith. It should be some kind of cloning spell, but the Grand Vader did not use spells to attack. He quickly made his own judgment of the situation. It should be because the soul of the clone is not stable enough. The spellcasters of the Ash world still use psionic power. Even if the Grand Vader is more powerful, he just has a higher level of psionic power. Then, Keyes' dragon head, which looked even more hideous because of the bleeding, revealed a cunning smile. Attacking the enemy's weak point has always been a good strategy. Following his thought, the super electromagnetic gun, which had been waiting to be fired, boomed. But the target was not the Grand Vader who had suddenly escaped, but the miniature version of Eternal Blaze that had been raised by the focusing tower. As a product of a powerful magical item, it was actually not completely completed. At least, the Grand Vader did not have time to cast a powerful protective spell on it. And this was undoubtedly a fatal oversight, whether it was for the young Blue Dragon, the Grand Vader, or the Medici Empire. The cannonball, accelerated to the limit by electromagnetism, undoubtedly hit the stationary target. Although it was completely vaporized after touching the edge of the miniature version of Eternal Blaze, the kinetic energy it carried was still transferred to the surface of its target. Eternal Blaze rolled down the hill, but this time what was left was not the afterglow, but the molten metal on the ground. "You stupid reptile!" The Grand Vader, who had wanted to snipe the young Blue Dragon, was now panic-stricken. He roared loudly, and even threw the dragon-slaying crossbow aside. If it explodes, the surrounding space will be shaken. You, me, and even the entire Medic Empire. No one will be able to escape. As if to prove what he said, the moment the miniature version of Eternal Blaze touched the ground, dazzling flames burst out. The ground turned into magma, and it began to sink to the center of the planet. The high temperature burned through the barriers added to the underground laboratory, but it also slowed down the speed of the miniature version of Eternal Blaze's descent. Having no time to care about his soul that was not stable because of his recent resurrection, the Grand Vader summoned all the strength in his body and turned the pure magic energy into a giant hand, fishing the miniature sun out of the magma by force. Here's an opportunity. Quitha's eyes lit up. The Grand Vader had no time to care about his situation, and he could start to unscrupulously pour his anger on the Grand Vader. Even if the Grand Vader was really in a critical situation, once the Grand Vader stabilized the little sun, he would be the one to suffer in the end. That wretched guy. Half of the body of the brand-new clone of the Grand Vader was destroyed by the cone-shaped force field that pierced through the magic shield that he erected in a hurry. Vomiting blood, he cursed in his heart. But thankfully, the miniature sun had been rescued and sealed with multiple restraining barriers. It was unlikely that it would explode at any moment. Thinking about that, the Grand Vader's eyes turned cold, which was a striking contrast to the miniature sun before him that was emitting light and heat. He pushed his hand forward and chanted the spell of control. Instantly, the miniature version of Eternal Blaze turned into a streak of brightness and reached the young Blue Dragon. Before he realized what was going on, it crashed into Keyes' chest brutally. After a dull explosion, a megalosaurus enshrouded in flames appeared in the underground laboratory, just like that. Let the light and heat from Eternal Blaze punish you and burn you into ashes in desperation. Stupid reptile. Chapter 349. He's not lying. Keyes used what was left of his thinking ability. Spatial ability will be interfered with by the radiation of this little sun. Everything was burning. The young Blue Dragon was like being in a furnace. He was both the firewood and the calcined object. Pain, without any explanation, assaulted him. But thanks to the gift of the great sage of guise, Keyes had mastered some skills of the psionic power and could block out sensory pain. Can I only be reborn with the help of the spirit crystal servant? Damn it, Keyes thought angrily. But apart from him being tortured by the blazing sun, the Grand Vader was not feeling well either. Having just escaped with the help of the clone and suppressed the rebellion of the miniature Eternal Blaze, The Grand Vader had no time to take care of the young blue dragon who was suffering. At least, he did not have the intention to do so at the moment. Chanting a few words, the Grand Vader flashed into a door that appeared in front of him. It was the room where he stored the secret medicine. He was going to take the secret medicine to restore his strength and energy, rest for a while to restore himself to the best state, and then deal with the young blue dragon. Or rather, the floor was full of burned debris. After fusing with the heart of the golden dragon and obtaining the bloodline inheritance of the strongest metal dragon, Keys was almost immune to fire. Even bathing in the magma was not difficult for him. But the high temperature of the little sun that was injected into his body was beyond his imagination. And this high temperature actually came from the light of the eternal blaze absorbed by the blazing sun crystal. It was a mighty force that Keys could not understand and could not resist at this time. Just when he had given up and was about to think about what to pay attention to in order to be reborn with the help of the spirit crystal servant, the burning little sun on his chest seemed to have ignited something, and the energy it emitted suddenly skyrocketed. The divine power has been ignited. Keys suddenly felt like crying, but had no tears. It had taken a lot of effort to kill the camel god, a pseudo-god on the island world. Although he had swallowed all of the camel god's divine power, the young blue dragon could hardly use that kind of energy. Now, all of his divine power reserves had been turned into firewood for Little Sunday. This made Keys feel extremely depressed. If only the active adaptive ability could be activated. The young blue dragon was indignant. Unfortunately, the body is probably completely carbonized, and the body's activity is probably... It hasn't completely disappeared. Feeling the sudden vitality in his body, Keys was shocked again. As his body recovered in the flames, the young blue dragon's innate ability to adapt came into play once again. He was adapting to the blazing sun punishment in an inexplicable way. And this change had actually exceeded his cognitive threshold. It was a secret that belonged to the gods. There were differences in godhead, but there was no difference in divine power. At least, that was the case for ordinary gods. Divine power was divine power. It was the embodiment of the power a god could control. However, the divine power a god of feeble divine power could control was less than 1/10,000th of that of a weak divine power. The disparity in the divine power possessed by higher-level gods was even greater. For ordinary beings, even obtaining a trace of divine power was an incredible opportunity. However, even if most mortals came into contact with divine power, they could not use this power normally. For example, Keys had used divine power to complete the evolution from passive adaptive ability to active adaptive ability. Under normal circumstances, the probability was almost zero. In order for a god to use divine power, they would first have to activate this power with their divine persona before they could make use of it. If divine power was used in the field corresponding to the god's priesthood, it would yield twice the result for half the effort. Otherwise, it would cost twice the amount of divine power. The young blue dragon was not a god, and he did not have godhead. However, the little sun implanted in his body emitted an astonishing amount of radiation. It happened to replace the godhead and completely activate the divine power in his body. At this time, he only needed to think about it to achieve the effect of changing reality. Because he hoped that his active adaptive ability would work, his charred body began to recover, and his innate active adaptive ability began to work again. The only prerequisite was that he had to pay enough divine power. Unfortunately, he did not have much divine power. Damn it, the speed of adapting to the little sun has slowed down. My divine power is about to be burned out. Although Keys still did not understand why his active adaptive ability would work again, he could roughly guess that it might have something to do with the divine power he had plundered from the camel god being ignited. It was indeed a pleasant surprise. However, just as he pulled himself away from the resentment of having suffered a double loss, he realized that the divine power stored in his body was about to run out. He might not be able to hold on for much longer. I can't just rely on my body's adaptive ability. I need to find some supplementary tools. The revitalization of his body also brought about other benefits. The young blue dragon felt that his ability to think had greatly improved. He came up with a new idea right away. His gaze shifted to the focus tower, not far away. He tried moving his body and realized that moving his body would increase the consumption of his divine power. I can't wait any longer. After making up his mind, Keys's tense body slammed toward the focus tower like a toppling pillar of gold. The super-hot flame ignited the giant golden tower-shaped, strange object in an instant. The golden residue that made up the tower began to soften and deform like melting ice cream. The top of the focus tower began to slide down. At that moment, Keys, who had aimed at his target, straightened his neck and opened his bloody mouth. He swallowed the top of the tower that was filled with pistol-shaped, blazing crystals into his stomach. I hope it works. The sudden devouring drained all the vitality in his body. The little sun that had been gradually suppressed by his flesh and blood broke through its shackles again. The young blue dragon staggered a little. Fortunately, he did not fall to the ground. However, just as his consciousness began to blur, the wish that he had just made was fulfilled by the ignited divine power again. The scorching crystals on the tip of the tower of focus were dissected and reassembled inside its stomach, turning into tiny crystals that stuck to the little sun and blocked the terrifying energy that it was unleashing. Keys's body temperature dropped immediately. He lowered his head and looked at his chest. The miniature eternal blaze inside his broken chest was still burning, but could not cause any damage to his body. Instead, he felt a sudden warmth on his body. Chapter 350. When the last wisp of heat flowed into his blood vessels and turned into a brand new energy circuit that connected to his entire body, the ignited quest finally cooled down completely. The surface of his body was covered with a hard shell made of molten matter, like a huge sculpture. Sensing the heart-palpitating pulse of energy that had just erupted, the Grand Vader, who had been hiding and consuming secret medicines to repair his body while licking the wounds on his soul, could no longer care much and stumbled out of the secret door once more. No, what he saw in front of his eyes made his eyes bulge. The towering tower of focus in the underground laboratory had collapsed to the ground like a crushed cake. Also, the most delicious corner of the tower seemed to have been bitten off by a certain naughty child. The great Wechtel could no longer control the anger in his heart. More than 300 years of unremitting efforts had gone down the drain. In a fit of anger, the #1 powerhouse of Medich was so angry that he coughed up blood and turned into a bloody mist. You wretched reptile, even death will not teach you how to be kind to others. I'm going to pull your soul out. So am I. The cold words abruptly popped up in the Grand Weasel's heart. That's the punishment you deserve. In fact, the Grand Weasel had noticed the enormous statue that Keys turned into just now, but he subconsciously thought that it was the residue of the young blue dragon after he was burned by the little sun. He could not figure out how the guy could absorb the miniature version of Eternal Blaze so smoothly. Cracking noises began to echo, and then cracks appeared on the hard shell on the surface of Keys' body. The annoying cracking noises were echoing nonstop. Finally, as a wave of force surged out, the whole broken shell was pushed far away. The Megalosaurus, which seemed to have been forged and whose body was more angular, appeared in the Grand Weasel's underground laboratory. After Quest absorbed the Strength Dragon's bloodline, his body was covered in a layer of mist-like scales. It seemed to have wrapped the stars in the sky, emitting a blurry and dazzling luster, an exceptionally contradictory yet very reasonable luster. The composition of the blazing sun crystal had been deciphered by the young blue dragon's active adaptation ability. Not only did it form a restraining device specifically designed to store the energy of eternal blaze inside his body, a hard membrane made of the same material was also plated on his body. Just like some famous seniors in other dimensions, Keys could now obtain energy by basking in the sun. He also found that his active adaptive ability had not stopped and even maintained a very stable power. However, it was no longer the divine power stored in his body that supplied him with energy. Instead, it was the miniature eternal blaze. Using one's own energy to drive the body to adapt to this kind of energy, this kind of awkward saying just proved that this kind of ability was extraordinary. Just like in many dark novels, perverts are the #1 productive force. In the fantasy genre, the more difficult it was to understand with common sense, and the more difficult it was to describe with words, the more unpredictable it would be. This is truly unpredictable. Keyes sensed his current state and could not help but imagine. I can absorb the light and heat of the eternal blaze. There are countless eternal blaze in the multiverse. If this ability is developed to the maximum, I may be able to evolve into the blazing dragon that devours the blazing sun. Billions of voices that sounded like bells seemed to have transcended time and echoed in the depths of the young blue dragon's mind all of a sudden. Keyes' brain could not help but have a brief outage. He seemed to see that in the multiverse, after an unknown number of years, a behemoth that was so enormous that he could not look at it directly suddenly opened its eyes and opened its mouth that looked like a black hole. Without the slightest sound, the blazing sun that had been wantonly sprinkling light and heat immediately began to collapse into the giant beast's mouth. Finally, it turned into food in its mouth and was swallowed into the giant beast's stomach. As it ate, the galaxy that lost the blazing sun collapsed abruptly, and all the worlds were thrown away. At the same time, because of the lack of light and heat from the blazing sun, those worlds became frozen kingdoms in the span of a few breaths. Starships rose from those worlds and approached the behemoth that had devoured the blazing sun. Without exception, all of them attacked that terrible existence at the same time, and then turned into dust in the multiverse in the blink of an eye. Keyes' consciousness began to function again. Just as he was guessing the relationship between himself and the behemoth that had appeared out of nowhere, the scene suddenly changed, and some other scenes appeared in his mind. The boundless galaxy was still the same background, and the behemoth was still swimming in the multiverse. This time, it was hovering in front of a dead planet, as if waiting for something. Soon, sand with a bronze luster began to gather, forming a gauzy curtain. A colossal dragon head lifted the curtain. It was covered in charcoal gray scales, and sand-like black scales covered its eyes like a mask. The time dragon. Keyes could not help but feel shocked when he saw the scene in his mind. The time dragon was the most powerful of all the megalosaurus, even for the dragon god. However, the first thing that this noble and extraordinary creature did after revealing its body was to lower its head to the megalosaurus that was even more massive in the galaxy. It was expressing its respect. Then, the two extraordinary creatures seemed to communicate for a moment. The time dragon nodded again and went back into the curtain made of bronze fine sand. The bronze fine sand slowly dissipated as if it had never appeared. Suddenly, a blazing light shone in the dark starry sky. The blazing sun dragon that had devoured the blazing sun opened its huge mouth, and a great power that could not be described with words gushed out of its body, suddenly descending into the interior of the planet in front of it. Because there was no medium, there should be no sound in the astral plane of the multiverse. However, at this moment, Keyes seemed to be able to imagine a loud noise that sounded like the sky was falling and the earth was cracking. A megalosaurus that was unimaginably powerful had ignited a planet with its breath. The planet that had been dead and silent instantly turned into a newborn, eternal blaze. It attracted other matter to it. At the same time, many tiny worlds began to be born around the eternal blaze. While Keyes was dumbfounded, the behemoth that was hovering in the galaxy inadvertently glanced at him. But the mere glance almost completely extinguished the fire of the young blue dragon's soul. I am a messenger of destruction and creation. I am the friend of time and order. I am the megalosaurus that has devoured the blazing sun. I am not the dominator, nor do I intend to be the dominator of all worlds. The dominator is also a servant. Remember, the godhood itself is a kind of restraint. Do not. The difference in the hierarchy of life made it impossible for Keyes to fully understand the creature's words. It was an indescribable and unpredictable special feeling, as if someone was carving axioms in his brain with a knife. There was no way and no need to prove them at all, because his words were the truth. Chapter 351. There was no sound, but there was also a loud bang. The very contradictory experience brought about an incredible sense of dizziness. Just a glimpse of a few short fragments, and Keyes' consciousness was already unable to bear it, and he passively withdrew from the wonderful senses just now. What was surprising was that although the magical scenes had left many traces in his consciousness, his brain was unable to perform the work of analyzing and thinking about them. Things that can't be looked at directly, things that can't be speculated. At least for now, I can only passively accept that information. Just as the young blue dragon was using his psionic ability to soothe some of his swollen nerves, the angry roar of the Grand Vader and the fierce attack that followed pulled him back to reality. "You stupid reptile." Keyes could not help but sneer at this repeated insult. This Grand Vader really had the potential of a failed web novel writer that he had seen in his previous life. All day long, he only knew how to use a lack of language to increase the word count. But the attack was really fierce. Not only did the opponent raise the dragon-slaying crossbow again, but he also shot 2 bolts that were very threatening to the Megalosaurus. At the same time, all kinds of spells attacked the young blue dragon as if they did not need to be prepared. Faced with the shooting bolts, Keyes instinctively wanted to dodge, but when he wanted to move, he felt that he had been hit by many special spells: Malice Transformation, Order, Shock, Anti-Teleportation spell. The young blue dragon was basically immune to these spells. The Grand Vader also knew this, but their purpose was not to hurt the enemy, but to organize the opponent to avoid the barrage of the dragon-slaying crossbow bolts. Keyes snorted coldly and mobilized an ability that he had just mastered. If I'm not going to dodge, then I'm not going to dodge. In an instant, his body turned into an elemental form composed of light and heat. The fierce crossbow bolts were melted by the high temperature when they passed through the external flames, turning into a pool of metal liquid. Some metal residue, carried by kinetic energy, directly passed through Keyes' body, and the dragon-slaying feature on the bolts lost its effect because the young blue dragon's life essence changed after the young blue dragon turned into an elemental body and lost its effect. There's residue, but it's still not hot enough. Then, Keyes felt his new form. I'll add more fire to it. Bam, bam, bam. A heartbeat like the beating of a drum sounded. His elemental body instantly expanded, and the color of the flames was almost white. The blazing heat suddenly burst out, and the entire underground laboratory seemed to be moved to the surface of the eternal blaze. Wherever the young blue dragon's gaze landed, everything was ignited. Whether it was the experimental props, raw materials, or even some of the magical restrictions protecting the laboratory, the structure itself began to become unstable. Spell maximum, elemental shield. Spell maximum, elemental resistance. Spell, elemental damage. Elemental damage at this time. The idiom one after another was perfectly interpreted by the Grand Vader. After casting 3 defensive spells on himself in a row, making himself temporarily immune to fire damage, he had the time to counterattack Keyes. Spell maximum, command dispelling. Admittedly, as the most powerful person in Medici, and perhaps the most powerful mage in the entire Ash Plane, the Grand Vader had great attainments in spell casting and had rich experience in fighting enemies. He directly saw that the young blue dragon was now in an elemental body state, and at the same time judged that Keyes' resistance to dispelling spells had been reduced. With the enhancement of supreme magical skill, the command dispelling was the greatest effect the spell could achieve. Based on the Grand Vader's experience, even an elemental prince from the inner elemental plane would be in danger of collapsing after being hit by such a furious spell. And yet, Keyes survived. Although the dispelling spell affected him, the core of the elemental body of his other incarnations was the miniature eternal blaze that burned inside his body. How could a spell cast by the Grand Vader in a hurry dispel the energy that he had collected over 300 years? Lifting a rock and dropping it on one's own foot was a perfect description of the current situation. But before the Grand Vader could feel regret, the young blue dragon's counterattack had already arrived. Now that one of them was bound to fall in such a situation, Keyes had no choice but to use his full power from the start. Dimensional Anchor, Psionic Ability, Soul Shackle. Two different systems of power were used at the same time, using spells to block the blue dragon's escape route, and psionic ability to seal the possibility that the Grand Vader could self-destruct his soul and be reborn in a clone body. The reason Keyes used psionic ability to target the blue dragon's soul was because he was worried that the Grand Vader, a powerful spellcaster, might be able to counter with some spells. As for psionic ability, although there were spells specifically used to counter psionic abilities, they were not of the same system and would be much less effective against psionic ability. And that was just the beginning. The young blue dragon abruptly reverted to his normal form and swung his fist at the Grand Vader's magical shield. At the same time, he opened his bloody maw and unleashed the Megalosaurus's most adept breath attack. As the saying went, random fists can kill an experienced master. Even if the Grand Vader had used all his tricks, he could not simultaneously resist spell weakening, psionic ability, physical blows, as well as the cationic breath attack mixed with fire, lightning, and conical force fields. With a crack, the magical shield around the Grand Vader shattered into primitive magical energy, and the young blue dragon's sharp claws pierced into the enemy's body with irresistible force. The tremendous force not only penetrated the Grand Vader's body, but also smashed his bones and muscles into a pile of mud. However, the strongest of Medica was still alive. At least Keyes could still feel the effects of spells in the mud. However, he did not want to give his opponent another chance to recover from his injuries and stand up again for a fair fight. His breath, which was a mixture of 3 different powers, evaporated the mud, corroded it, and turned it into powder or something else. Spell Extreme, Soul Annihilation, Psionic Ability, Soul Scatter. In a fantasy world, if you wanted to eliminate the root of the problem, you must not let go of the enemy's soul after dealing with the body. Originally, using one ability to deal with the Grand Vader's remnant soul was enough, but Keyes used 2 different methods to be safe. Double insurance. This time you must. A hint of relief flashed in the young blue dragon's eyes, but then he found that on the remains of the Grand Vader, or more appropriately, residue, there was suddenly a wave of energy rising. What is this? PS1. Thank you to book friend Sino Warrior 201812050811140 20181114094014449 Chi Wu, Taiyong, Midnight, 1406-211426022361, Apata Maple Candy, White Silk Twin Ponytails JK, Han Jejia, Emil Regis, Gray Soul Wolf, Autumn Li Ching Lan, Ordivision Radiation, Sunmi My Love, Blank Paper Ink Seal, Misty Wind and Xiao Yu, Satan's Necromancer, 161202200130788, Betrayal of the Cold Alliance, Time Flows Like Water, Attack on the Castle, and Shouting 246 who has always supported me. Thank you for your rewards. Whenever I feel like giving up, I always go to the writer's assistant to look through everyone's messages and reward records, and then encourage myself. Everyone has witnessed my change from a pure noob to a noob who can write a little. I will persevere, no matter how difficult it is. I will finish this book. PS2. The above content is not included in the chargeable word count. Chapter 352. Was a zombie or a resurrection? But this was too incomplete. There was no change in a pile of minced meat, only some inexplicably complex soul aura. Besides, Quest was confident that he could deal with a WYRM that was above the legendary level. Unless he went berserk, no matter if it was a zombie or a resurrection, Quest was confident in dealing with all accidents. At worst, I'll kill it again. If one time doesn't work, I'll kill it twice. If 2 times still don't work, then Just as the young blue dragon was about to put his idea into action, the treacherous soul fluctuation suddenly fled far away. It fled to a corner of the underground laboratory and immediately turned into a dense fog. I'm not this generation's Alan, young Megalosaurus. It's hard to imagine that we meet again so soon. A familiar voice sounded in his mind, and Keys finally reacted. This was the soul fluctuation of the ancient soul binding wizard Shurik, whom he had met in the North Tower before. In this regard, the young blue dragon did not suspect any trickery. The soul was different from the body in appearance, and it could not be completely imitated by spells or other means. Even if the great Wektel had borrowed a clone body to escape, the new soul would have slight differences from the previous soul. Although the great Wektel and the previous generations of Allans were actually the reincarnations of Shurik, their souls would not be exactly the same as the ancient soul binding wizard. And in front of creatures with psionic powers, this difference would be particularly obvious. You have succeeded in killing my reincarnator. Although it's contradictory, I may have to thank you for this. Shurik had long been dead, but this amazingly talented ancient soul binding wizard had actually found a way to continuously reincarnate. He had branded his remaining soul with the authority to mobilize the North Tower of soul binding, and through a random method, he had transferred this soul to a child who was compatible with him in the present world. Of course, even if the previous generations of Allans were not chosen when they were young, with their extraordinary talent, most of them could become powerful spellcasters. The reason was simple. How could a person with mediocre talent be compatible with the soul of a genius like Shurik? However, after fusing with Shurik's remnant soul, he would inevitably become the most powerful spellcaster in the Ashen world. However, there was a price to pay. As the descendants of Shurik, the Allans not only had to maintain the normal operation of the spirit binding tower, but they also had to shoulder the responsibility of fighting anyone who dared to invade this world without the protection of the gods. And it was precisely because of this great responsibility that a certain Allan in history had signed an alliance with Medici, the most powerful empire in the Ashes world. On the condition of protecting Medici and supporting the House of Ascender for generations, he had become the great Vexel of the Medici Empire and enjoyed equal power in this land, second only to Pharaoh's authority. Although Shurik's reincarnation was not a rebirth, each Allan actually had their own independent soul. However, they had been fused with the remnant soul of the ancient soul binding sorcerer since they were young, so they would naturally be subtly influenced as they grew up, unless he was stimulated by something else. For example, the Devil Calamity and the war started by the Devil Earl. 300 years ago, the invasion of Bartholomew's outpost in the Ash world was just an insignificant plain battle for Bartholomew's 9 hells. At most, some of the more astute great devils had discovered some clues from the abnormal actions of this devil Count Canini. But for a world that was on the verge of collapse, and a guardian that needed to exert great effort to maintain the normal operation of this world, the war started by the devil invasion became the last straw that broke the camel's back. The great Vexel of the Medici Empire, as the most important force on the battlefield, was inevitably eroded by the power of Bader, even if he himself did not realize it. He slipped from the neutral camp to the evil camp. The change of camp completely separated him from his original ideology, creating a huge divergence. Why should I sacrifice for a world for free? What can the Ashes world repay me with? Only by finding my own power can I fully enjoy freedom. Depravity always began from the bottom of one's heart. He began to plan his own future and began to study how to break free from the shackles of using soul magic and grasp a way to completely master his own power. Every Allan was a person of extraordinary talent and wisdom. One day, when the great Vexel looked up and saw the eternal blaze hanging high in the sky, he suddenly had a source of inspiration. Thus, his ideas were gradually put into practice and eventually evolved into everything that happened later, including his own destruction. This child was very powerful and very talented. He completely blocked my soul's perception, and only after his death today did I fully understand the plan that he had been preparing for more than 300 years. Unfortunately, it's too late now. As if watching a movie, the remnant of Shurik's soul projected everything he knew into Keys's mind. In addition to the truth, the young blue dragon also saw many of the great Vexel's precious research memories, which was an unexpected gain. Keys also had his own speculations about the purpose of this remnant soul. I can let you go and even help you complete the next reincarnation process, but I need to sign a contract with you as a form of protection. Contract. There was a slight fluctuation in the voice projected by the remnant soul, as if there were some doubts. I'm just a remnant soul. Don't worry, even if it's a remnant soul, there's still a contract that can be used as the main body. With that, a sincere smile appeared on Keys's face. The next morning, the sky in Bite City was exceptionally clear, as if to sweep away the sultry heat of the previous night. Pharaoh sat upright in the commander's seat in the office, listening to the situation summarized by the attendants below. According to the reply given by the ceremonial officer, the grasping compass in the treasury has been taken away by the duty sect. He, the chief of the fire dwarves and Commander Winfong, who is about to arrive, will personally look for the reincarnation of the Great Vexel. The result is estimated to be the same as before, and the reincarnation is most likely a child less than 10 years old. How's the drafting of the court bulletin? How will you announce the reason for the reincarnation of the Great Vexel? Cinder suddenly remembered something. He interrupted the lengthy report of the attendant and asked the part he was most interested in. Pharaoh knows that the museum in the Lagoon Lake area has been taken over by the Naroya guards. After a preliminary investigation, the reason for the sudden accident of the Great Vexel was that he was carrying out an extremely dangerous spell experiment, and there was an accident in the experiment. What about the situation of the Megalosaurus Pasha? How is the implementation of the cooperation plan that the Scale of Perpetual Order just submitted? Pharaoh asked the things he was interested in one by one, and his attendants summarized the situation while answering in detail. At this time, Keys had already stepped onto the airship sent by the Scale of Perpetual Order and was heading towards Nome. Standing on the deck of his flagship, the Leviathan, and bathed in the light of the eternal blaze, Keys could not help but feel relieved. I already knew that things like cleaning up have to be left to the professionals. Chapter 353. In the Strategic Defense Attack and Logistics Security Bureau of the First Layer of Batsu, the Batsu staff member with the number 2274 greeted his colleagues who had just gotten off work while sorting out the documents at hand. It seemed that everything was the same as usual. But only the person involved knew that it was just on the surface. In fact, he was already burning with anxiety. If it weren't for the fact that the demons had no sweat glands on their bodies, he would have been sweating profusely. In the face of a major event, you need to be calm. Repeatedly reciting the 6-word maxim in the first work guidance manual that he received when he first joined the job, 2274 wanted to calm himself down so that he could come up with a solution as soon as possible, even if it was just making up a false story. But he just couldn't do it. As time went by, his originally normal body began to tense up, and he couldn't help but clamp his tail between his legs. Damn it, I knew I wasn't cut out for this job during the psychological assessment exam, but I still had to spend a lot of money to pass the exam. 2274 couldn't help but feel a little self-reproachful. I'm so stupid, really. What made this successful person in the eyes of many demons? The Batsa Devil, who had successfully sneaked into the bureaucratic system of the 9 prisons of Bader, who had a far faster promotion system than his peers. Headache was a routine notice to resume work. He had already set aside enough time for preparation and informed the commander of the bloody battle, who had just finished his wartime leave, of the return time in advance. Out of the importance of a friendly unit like the Evil Dragon Council, he had also specially arranged for people to pick him up. But now, the return time had been delayed for 2 days, and the commander had yet to arrive at the front line of the bloody battle. Due to the low efficiency of the bureaucratic system, the feedback on this matter had not been sent to the superior of 2274's desk in time. But in the 9 prisons of Bader, which was an extremely orderly, even if it was an orderly evil, country. Once the violation of the military order was exposed, not only would the commander be punished, but the staff responsible for the notification would also be punished. And in the Strategic Defense Attack and Logistics Security Bureau of the first layer of Bader, such negligence could be caught by some of 2,274's competitors and become the trigger for his self-destruction. No, I can't run away. The last time something like this happened, the clerk hid in Sigil City. In the end, he couldn't escape the assassin's assassination. 2274, who was about to run away, suddenly remembered a previous case. He couldn't help but give up the idea of running away. Although it's also against the law to contact the door key beyond my rank, I've already messed up a military order, so I don't mind breaking it again. If it succeeds, as long as he arrives at the front line, I will be able to find an excuse to disassociate the responsibility of the commander's failure to arrive at the front line in time for me. He had to admit that it was not a coincidence that he was able to enter Batsu's elite bureaucracy. His thinking was indeed very clear. The order he received was to convey the transfer order to the front line of the bloody battle. The commander who was on leave did not return on time. There were only two reasons. First, the informant, 2274, did not deliver the correct information. Second, the commander did not carry out the order himself. As long as the other party used the door key to come to the front line of the bloody battle, no matter what happened, it would be their own fault. If the other party did not even go to the front line of the bloody battle, 2274 might be the one to take the blame when it was found out later. Previously, he had given the door box that was used to open the interdimensional portal and the door key that was used to determine the exact coordinates to the person in charge of Bardo Outpost and the commanding officer who was on leave, respectively, through a communication spell. Now, there was a problem. It was possible that one of the two links had a problem, or both of them, but it was meaningless to contact the door key now. He could only contact the owner of the door key. If that was not possible, he could only use the door key to remotely open the interplane portal. I really don't know what that incompetent demon count is doing. This kind of incompetent guy really deserves to die. After sorting out his thoughts, 2,247 rubbed his forehead, got up, and walked to his private interplane communication room. He kept cursing in his heart. Although he hated both of them to the core, he could only curse one of them. In order to calculate the actual number of soul prisms consumed by the interplane communication and put an end to the phenomenon of false reimbursement in Batsu's bureaucratic department, the Strategic Defense Attack and Logistics Bureau of Batsu's first-level territory had set up a private communication room for every employee. They could use special spells to calculate the number of soul prisms consumed in real time. Moreover, according to the latest regulations of the Bureau, the number of soul prisms that every Batsu employee could claim every month was a quota that was calculated based on big data statistics. If they spent more than the reimbursement quota while carrying out a mission, they would have to pay for the excess. As long as I can get in touch, I will definitely get this money back from that guy who has no concept of time. After verifying the secret key, 2,274 walked into his private interplane communication room. He immediately activated all the defensive magic circles he had set up. No matter what, he could not let his colleagues know what he was doing. Then, he tried to contact the owner of the door keys, who was lying on a soft bed in human form. Beep beep. The subscriber you have dialed is connecting. Please wait. Beep beep. The subscriber you have dialed is connecting. Please wait. Beep beep. You are in arrears. Please insert another soul prism into the coin slot. When 2274 painfully took out a soul prism for the 13th time, the beep beep sound finally stopped coming from the other end of the communication device. With two crisp creaking sounds, an image finally appeared on a bronze mirror in front of 2,274. This was a spacious bedroom. There was a large bed in the middle of the bedroom. Keys, who 2274 had been anxiously waiting for, was lying on the bed and sleeping soundly. In order to facilitate the delivery of some items, the communication device allowed 2274 to extend part of his body out of the bronze mirror. Just as he was about to stretch out his palm and slap the snoring guy's face to wake him up and question him, "How can you be so careless?" he suddenly saw a small blackboard next to the door key he had located. On it, there were neatly written words in Inferno. "Want to know why I'm late? Want to know the conspiracy that a demon count has been plotting for hundreds of years?" Level the blackboard. For Batsu, conspiracy was like a bear with honey. It had an unparalleled attraction. 2274 was no exception. So he involuntarily stretched out his hand and gently leveled the blackboard. He tried to make as little noise as possible so as not to wake up the sleeping megalosaurus. There was a small box behind the blackboard. There was a note on top of the box. It read, "Remove the note. There is a small hole below. Please insert 13 soul prism and the answer will be revealed." 2274 sucked in a breath of cold air, but he still opened the note and looked at the black hole on the box below. After a long struggle, he gritted his teeth and put the note into the soul prism. He really wanted to know what the conspiracy was. Ring, ring, ring. The switch was pressed by a heavy object, and the alarm clock in the box suddenly rang. Chapter 354. You mean, number 2274's eyes widened. Kanini disobeyed Bateau's military order, but he wants to drag this world into Bateau. Standing next to the fireplace and adding new firewood to the flickering flames, Keyes shrugged. That's right. What's his motive for doing this? He's a demon count, and he just needs to follow the prescribed order to be promoted? Motive was always the starting point for demons to consider things. If they were smart demons, they would also consider the motive of motive. Obtaining promotion and avoiding demotion was their eternal pursuit in their long lives. But this had nothing to do with Keyes. He didn't want to get involved in the Batsu people's system. Even after destroying the Grand Vexer, in the study of the underground laboratory, he found the Grand Vexer's records and speculations about Kanini's actions. I don't know his motive, but from the perspective of weighing the pros and cons, Kanini dared to attempt to disobey Bateau's military order, which is obviously a precise calculation. For him, the pros outweigh the cons very irresponsibly. The young blue dragon waved his hand and said to the Batsu correspondent in the fireplace in front of him, "It sounds right, but it's actually useless. You can slowly study this topic on your own. There must be much more literature in the Nine Hells than in this remote plane. The most important thing now is that you have to be responsible for the follow-up of my military orders. Otherwise, I will lodge a complaint. Dereliction of duty, failing to identify a small group of bad elements with ulterior motives, or dereliction of duty." In the flames of the fireplace, Barthos's correspondent changed from his previous state of being suppressed due to his thirst for knowledge. A hypocritical smile appeared on his projected face, and Quest saw the word contempt in it. As a veteran organization that has been ranked as one of the top 10 units in Bateau for many years, our company does have a complaint window. But the window is not located anywhere in the 9 prisons of Bader. It is set up in the 7 hills of Heaven, Mountain Paradise. But fortunately, it is only on the 2nd level of Mochulia, which is commonly known as the Golden Paradise. However, I still have to give you a friendly reminder that the kingdom of the Platinum Dragon God Bahamut is stationed there. You are welcome to complain. Every opinion you give will help us improve our work. As expected, this was indeed very demonic. Living within the rules, they were naturally good at using the rules to protect themselves. They were extremely tyrannical. If it was someone else, they would either fly into a rage or feel helpless about this operation. But who was Keyes? Putting aside the fact that he was a protagonist loved by thousands of readers, he was an existence that could make the naturally greedy Yugros Judge Magic Merchant admire. Bloody battles are everywhere. The young blue dragon glanced at the projection of 2274 and said coldly, "This was not Keyes's own conclusion, but the words of the master of 9 hells, who lived in the depths of Nessus. For the Batsa Devil clan, the words of that existence were the golden rule, which was higher than all the rules set by the bureaucracy. On the conscription order, it was clearly stated that the moment I stepped onto the front lines of the bloody battle, I would immediately have the title of commander. The terms clearly stated that the conscription location was the front lines of the bloody battle, and not the narrow sense of the bottomless abyss. Kanini hindered me from going to the abyss to participate in the bloody battle. His actions will have an adverse effect on the war. This is both a betrayal and proof that the bloody battle has extended to this plane. Resisting him and confirming his death is my contribution to the bloody battle. According to that Lord's regulations, the commander of the bloody battle enjoys authority above all Bader organizations in his jurisdiction. Your projection has already descended upon my jurisdiction and should be under my command. If you disobey, halfway through his words, the young blue dragon who had transformed into human form sat on a chair by the fireplace and smiled brightly at 2274. According to that Lord's regulations, I can directly demote you as punishment. You could try. As he said this, red lightning suddenly appeared on the young blue dragon's fingertips and crackled. Gulp. 2274, who was in the projection state, swallowed his saliva. As a staff member of the Barthol official organization, he was quite knowledgeable. Naturally, he could recognize that the red lightning in Quest's hand was a power that caused most of the Barthol devils to tremble in fear. I'm so stupid, really. 2274 kept howling in his heart, but he did not dare to curse. Keys was not the lord of the Batsa devil, nor was he his direct superior. There was only one reason why he could show the power of demotion. His words were in accordance with the will of the 9 prisons of Bader, which meant that he was in accordance with the rules set by that existence in the depths of Nessus. That was why Bader had given him the authority to punish other devils. However, with 2274's knowledge, he did not know that if he had not taken the initiative to contact Keys, the young blue dragon's bloody battle commander would not have been recognized by the will of the 9 prisons of Bader. This was because the regulations stated that Commander had at least one subordinate that had been appointed by Bader. Moreover, this downgrade power wasn't enough to punish all of the Batsa devils. Lord Bader and their various forms of incarnations and direct subordinates, as well as the Devil Duke and the Devil Counts who were directly loyal to the Duke, were not within the scope of the punishment of demotion. Of course, Keys did not need to tell 2274 this knowledge. In fact, he had only come into contact with these regulations not long ago. He had to thank Kanini, who had been directly annihilated by the Great Vexual. That astute and studious Devil Count carried many books with him, including many of his lecture notes that he had painstakingly made when he was studying at the famous academy in Nessus. After his death, his spatial equipment was naturally taken away by the Great Vexual. After the Great Vexual was killed by Keys, those items changed owners again and fell into the hands of the young blue dragon. It had to be said that a genius was a genius. Kanini's lecture notes were actually indexed, and some of them were even abstracts. According to the index, Keys did not need to flip through the entire book. He quickly found the corresponding content. It did not take long for him to find a way to get rid of the charge of disobeying a military order. It seemed that 2274's loss was not unjustified. Knowledge was power. He did not lose to Keys, but to knowledge. My lord, of course I do not want to disobey your orders. I will immediately construct the highest level of interplanar teleportation gate. I only need a road sign and precise coordinates. Keys put away the thunder in his hand and tapped on the door key beside him. A string of runes appeared, and he said generously, "It would have been better if you had done this earlier. Give me a longer time to open the teleportation gate. I still have to inform a few of my followers and give them some time to prepare." Understood. 2274's attitude immediately turned to flattery. He no longer considered how many soul prisms were needed to maintain the interplanar communication device, nor did he consider how many soul prisms were needed to replenish energy to forcefully open the interplanar portal without a doorbox. Maintaining the maximum output, 2274 waited for Keys' companions to enter the teleportation gate. Only when Keys, the commander, was about to raise his foot did 2274 breathe a sigh of relief. He did not want to think about how many soul prisms he had taken out today, but he was destined to live frugally for the next decade or so. Before leaving, Keyes looked at 2274's pale face in the projection and smiled brightly again. Let me give you a piece of advice. You have the capital to spend lavishly. Chapter 355. As it turned out, Keyes's previous worries were unfounded. Compared to the messenger of the conscription order, the true initiator of the order was much more lax about the concept of time. This could be seen from the efficiency of the Evil Dragon Council's officials on the front lines of the Blood War. Keyes waited for an entire day before the other party sent him a letter of confirmation that was only 3 to 4 pages long. The letter was actually only stamped with the seal of the Evil Dragon Council, and it was done hastily. I can only say that, as expected of long-lived species, the young blue dragon who had transformed into a human silently complained in his heart. Those bats a devil. They clearly have lives that have no upper limit to their lifespans, but they live their lives in seconds every day. In fact, his thoughts were both correct and incorrect. Compared to the Megalosaurus, the Batsu people did not have the pressure of their lifespans at all. However, unless they were extremely powerful, ordinary Batsu people would rarely die of old age. Most of them would die in various schemes. On the other hand, the Megalosaurus race not only had a much longer lifespan compared to other short-lived species, but they could also gradually become powerful enough to protect themselves within 100 or 200 years. The pressure of an ordinary Megalosaurus to survive was actually much lower than that of a Batsa-devil. Therefore, in order to cope with their long lifespans, many Megalosaurus would cultivate all kinds of strange hobbies for themselves. However, the desire to enjoy life was definitely the basic demand of most Megalosaurus, which was almost instinctive. Since they liked to enjoy life, they naturally needed servants to serve them. The number of servants a Megalosaurus had varied according to the individual's strength, ranging from 1 to 200 servants to tens of thousands. When hundreds of powerful Megalosaurus gathered in the same plane, the number of servants they needed was comparable to dozens of armies in a mortal kingdom. In the acid fog canyon dimension, the demon's acid fogworms would definitely not choose to serve the Megalosaurus. The Batsu Devil on the front lines of the bloody battle were all experienced elites. They would naturally not listen to the Megalosaurus orders. As a result, the mercenaries that were originally stationed in the acid fog canyon all changed classes and became the servants of the Megalosaurus. They were no longer in charge of specific combat missions. They were only in charge of taking care of the Megalosaurus sent by the Evil Dragon Council. Even so, there was still a large gap in the number of servants required by the Megalosaurus. Due to the might of the Evil Dragon Council and the colorless Dragon Empress, as well as the strength of the Megalosaurus army, they were indeed the key to the outcome of this bloody battle. Therefore, Barthol had no choice but to mobilize resources from every corner of the multiverse to replenish the Megalosaurus servants. The mercenaries from other dimensions, as the first batch of servants, were now responsible for supervising the newcomers. So, I have now changed from frontline commander to a logistics manager. After carefully reading the confirmation letter from the Evil Dragon Council's clerk, Keyes could not help but feel speechless. It was not that he was dissatisfied with this arrangement. If he had known this would happen, he would not have rushed to the acid fog canyon dimension in such a hurry. Due to the evacuation of himself and his companions, the scale of perpetual order still lacked the protection of high-end combat power, even though they had some military power. Therefore, they had no choice but to reduce their operations. Many of the benefits were also given by Keyes to collaborators such as Pharaoh. He was a Megalosaurus of the lawful evil faction. It was not surprising that he had the mindset of earning less is losing. Therefore, Keyes could not help but feel that it was a pity that he only needed to do some non-essential work even though he had the status of a commander. Although there will be some silent costs, the position of logistics manager does not require me to go to the battlefield. I don't have to deal with the Demon Lord who probably hates me to the core. I also don't have to worry about exposing my strength in front of the colorless Dragon Empress and attracting suspicion. Fortunately, he had a good mentality and could always find some reason to persuade himself. But what really surprised Quest was that after coming to the plane of the acid fog canyon, he could still feel himself absorbing the energy from the sky at any time and place. It should be noted that there was no eternal blaze in the acid fog canyon. In the sky of this dimension, there was only a gloomy, celestial body that emitted a pale green luster, providing limited light to this world. Under such circumstances, Keys could still absorb energy. This meant that the blazing crystal created by the Grand Vader, a wondrous item that had now become a part of the young blue dragon's body, had a wide range of applications and incredible power. Just by verifying this good news, giving up those short-term benefits is nothing. This is not a loss. The young blue dragon, who was good at thinking and summarizing, finally convinced himself to be less worried. Since he was already here, he might as well take things as they came. After calming his mind, he began to think about how to be the logistics manager of the Megalosaurus army. Just like the laws of all worlds, an increase in population would always bring prosperity to the settlement. Although there is a certain degree of danger in being the servants of the Megalosaurus, and there would be a large number of non-combat casualties every day, the 9 prisons of Bader had a solid foundation. After the mobilization order was issued, the strategic teleportation portal that transported mortal servants to the acid fog canyon dimension had not stopped working for a single day. Therefore, the town that was originally built by the mercenaries under Keyes' command could no longer accommodate these newcomers. At this time, after a short year of expansion, the town had become a city. In the beginning, the arrival of such a large group of people had brought a series of troubles. Although the Batsa Devil did not need to eat, drink, or breathe, and the logistics sent by the Infernal Legion only needed to satisfy the daily needs of the Megalosaurus. However, the logistics department of Bader had neglected, or it could be said that they did not consider the survival ability of the mortal servants at all. Unless there were a few very powerful individuals, if ordinary mortals did not have water or food for several days, only death would await them. Whether it was the Bader Expeditionary Force or the Megalosaurus army, they seemed to have overestimated their deterrence at the beginning. Under the pressure of death, many servants chose to rob and kill other mortals to replenish their needs. Robbery, torture, cannibalism. Although in the eyes of the Bader Expeditionary Force's commander, these tragedies were basically in the nature of the entertainment program, something that they could not tolerate finally happened. Chaos replaced order. At this time, they remembered that the bottomless abyss was originally a place where order withered and chaos flourished. The flames of chaos could cause a prairie fire at any time, and this situation would undoubtedly affect the combat power of the Batsu people, because they were the representatives of the creatures that followed order. Therefore, the Bader Expeditionary Force had no choice but to send people to carry out bloody suppression of the servant army several times. In order to eliminate the hidden dangers, some senior demons even wanted to completely exterminate the mortals, but they were opposed by the Megalosaurus army. Helplessly, the logistics department of Bader had to take on more responsibilities and began to regularly deliver supplies to the servant army in the acid fog canyon dimension. Now, the first task that Keyes had to carry out was to be responsible for the distribution of these supplies. Chapter 356. On the second day of his arrival in the bottomless abyss, Keyes, the newly appointed logistics officer, set a goal for himself. His goal was simple, and that was to let his subordinates, who came from other planes, eat their fill. This was not the work of a saint. Instead, it was because people would gradually become accustomed to order after having enough to eat and warm clothes. It was only in places where the power of order was abundant that the Bader Expeditionary Force, which worked together with the Megalosaurus army, could unleash their greatest strength. When that time came, it would naturally not be his turn to fight again, and he would be forced to rush to the front lines. With this in mind, the young blue dragon worked very hard. He was even more diligent than the last time he came to Acid Fog Canyon. It only took him half a day to visit all the logistics departments, but the results of his observations were not optimistic. Originally, the young blue dragon had thought that the worst situation in this city would be similar to the mercenary camps from other planes that he had stayed in before. But after his investigation, he regretfully discovered that the 9 prisons of Bader's attitude towards the mortals from other planes was worse than the worst. Previously, the camp in a remote corner of Avernus would still deliver some supplies and weapons on a regular basis. But here, Bader's logistics department only delivered some rations on a regular basis to ensure that the mortals would not all starve to death. For most people, having enough to eat every day was an extravagant hope. Only the strongest few could snatch food from others and eat half a full meal. Was it because Bader's logistics department did not have the ability to mobilize supplies? The answer was definitely no. The portals that transported the servant armies from all over the multiverse to Acid Fog Canyon opened every day. As long as the devils were willing, they could easily deliver some food over. It was just that they were unwilling to do so. After thinking for a moment, Keyes understood the devil's intentions. Were they afraid that the mortals from other planes would have the ability to overthrow the expeditionary army after eating their fill? Of course, that wasn't the case. Every mortal who was thrown into the Acid Fog Canyon was actually burdened with a devil contract that could never be broken under normal circumstances. As long as the commander of the expeditionary army willed it, these people would immediately lose their lives. The real reason why Bader's logistics department was unwilling to provide sufficient food was that they had already regarded these mortals as opportunity costs, or rather, a kind of consumable. They were unwilling to invest more in them. Moreover, based on the experience of the bloody battle at the front line, although Barthos's side had the absolute advantage, it was not entirely impossible for the offensive and defensive situation to be reversed in the blink of an eye. It was even possible for the entire army to be wiped out. At that time, the more they invested in consumables, the greater their losses would be. As for the lack of personnel due to starvation or unnatural deaths while serving the Megalosaurus, they had their portals open anyway and could replenish themselves from other parts of the multiverse at any time. As expected of the devil's thinking. Having figured this out, Keyes could not help but sigh. Human lives are like grass. They still have to be picky. In his human form, the young blue dragon walked alone on the streets of the Abyss City. He did not need to deliberately maintain his appearance. The effect similar to the Power Dragon's talent, Blur, made his body half hidden, and he would not attract the attention of others at all. With the authority of a commander, Quest was also a general of the 9 Hells of Bartholomew. Because he once had to carry out an airdrop mission, the Bartholomew Garrison Department had assigned him the elite Bone Demon Guards. They were still under his command. Early in the morning, Keyes asked them to accompany Brew out. He still remembered that the Ogre Gourmet had many properties in the original town. At that time, he only took out the profits on the books and returned to the Ashen World. At this time, he could take back those properties one by one. And among those properties, there was a wartime medical camp and a tavern called True Fragrance, both of which could be used in Keyes' future reorganization plan. So, it was better to get control of them as soon as possible. Brew and the elite Bone Demon Guards should have already finished their business and sent a magic message to him. But half a day had passed, and the young blue dragon still did not receive any message, which made him a little worried. Under normal circumstances, there shouldn't be any accidents, right? Keyes thought to himself. Even if the mortals in this city no longer recognize Brew, can't they recognize the elite Bone Demons? That's the treatment of the guards that only the senior commanders of the demons have. This Abyss City built by the Servant Corps was nominally under the management of the Batsid Devil Army, but the Batsid Devil only sent soldiers to guard the defense facilities or supervise the servants to serve the Megalosaurus army on time in the Dragon's Nest. For the management of this place, the Batsu people only sent soldiers who would simply and crudely execute all the servants who did not abide by the rules. And because this group of servants could be found by the demons, it was conceivable that they were not good people. Plus, their souls had been predetermined by the contract, so after death, they could not be extracted to make soul prisms. In other words, in the eyes of the Batsu people, this group of people had no benefits at all. None of the demons on the front line of the bloody battle were willing to waste their precious time. They were either participating in the battle or preparing for the next battle in the camp. Except for the assigned soldiers, no demons would take the initiative to come to this abyss city. As for the Megalosaurus army, they all lived in the huge dragon's nest that Sui Xiong had changed the landscape of the acid fog canyon and built. Usually, except for participating in the battle, they actually rarely left their nest. Unlike the young blue dragon, normal Pinochet Megalosaurus were rarely willing to transform into human form. Most of them looked down on the weak mortal races. Most of the Pinochet Megalosaurus who dared to come to the acid fog canyon to participate in the battle were battle maniacs of their own race. They were extremely confident in their own strength and disdained to use the appearance of mortals, let alone be associated with them. Then things were very strange. Without the participation of the Megalosaurus and the senior demons, Keys, as the commander in charge of logistics, actually held the highest authority in this abyss city. Even if those people had not seen his strength and were not really afraid of the young blue dragon, would they dare to fight against a team of elite bone demons? With doubts in his mind, Keys turned around and walked to the location of the True Fragrance Tavern in his memory. After all, compared to the medical camp, the tavern seemed to be closer and could be reached by walking a few steps. If Brew was not there, it would not be too late to go elsewhere. Chapter 357. Walking to the street where the True Fragrance Tavern was located, Keys saw the elite bone demon guards standing in front of the tavern from afar like bellboys welcoming guests. The tavern signboard was openly hung in the middle of the street, but it was no longer True Fragrance Tavern but Devil's Stomach. Looking at the inferno language on the shop sign, Quest couldn't help but twitch his mouth. They're in the devil's territory, but they chose a name that's related to the devil. How careless. Of course, complaining was one thing. Seeing the bone demon guards standing in front of the tavern, the young blue dragon was relieved. His companion, the ogre gourmet, did not seem to have encountered any difficult problems. It's good that he's fine. Otherwise, if there was a fight, it would be troublesome to tear down and rebuild the tavern. There was an iron law in the fantasy world. Taverns were the best places to get information. According to Keys' plan, if he wanted to firmly control the Abyss City, he had to do both logistics distribution and intelligence coordination, and both had to be strong. Therefore, the original True Fragrance Tavern and now Devil's Stomach were actually a relatively key intelligence collection point. It was best not to make any drastic changes and immediately use it to serve him. Knowing that his companion was fine, Keys was not so anxious. He removed the blur effect on himself and signaled the bone demons who wanted to salute him to keep quiet and continue to stand guard. Then he stepped into the Devil's Stomach. With the Megalosaurus' excellent sense of smell, the young blue dragon smelled blood at the entrance of the tavern. However, in addition to the smell of blood, the Devil's Stomach was also mixed with the smell of many spices, indicating that most of the places here were butchering and cooking. It was not unusual in the plane of the evil alignment. Stepping on the floor of the tavern, the decoration inside was very different from the last time he saw it. The ring that was originally used for the drinking competition had long been removed and replaced with more tables and chairs. Of course, these new pieces of furniture had nothing to do with elegance and comfort, but they were strong and sturdy. They were completely unpolished rocks. The tall ones were used as tables, and the short ones were used as chairs. Even if there was a fight, it would be difficult for ordinary people to cause damage to the tavern. There were no waiters in the tavern. Only a human dressed as a chef was busy in the open kitchen behind the bar counter. There was only one guest in the tavern, Brew, who was sitting near the bar counter. Keys' footsteps were very light, and he did not disturb the two people who were busy. The chef was concentrating on processing the strange ingredients in his hands. He was trying his best to remove the glands from a decapitated acid mistworm. The pot of oil beside him was already boiling. The ogre gourmet was sitting in front of the bar with his head lowered. He bent over the desk and wrote furiously. Seeing this, Keys couldn't help but feel a little surprised. He walked straight to the bar counter. He didn't restrain his footsteps. Hearing the movement behind him, the ogre gourmet turned around alertly. At the same time, he reached out to grab the wailing harpoon on the bar counter. Keys, you came at the right time. Seeing the young blue dragon, Brew immediately showed a surprised expression. I'd like to introduce you to Master Gree. He's definitely a top chef. We found a treasure this time. Hearing Brew's words, the chef, who was fiddling with the acid mistworm, turned around and looked at Keys. He nodded slightly in respect and continued with his work. He used the tip of his knife to remove the glands from the special ingredients. Keys wasn't annoyed. He chatted with Brew while he read the contents of the ogre's notes. Brew had opened a chapter titled Gree Culinary Essences in his Ogre Gourmet Guide. He used neat handwriting to carefully record some of the knowledge he had just learned from Gree. Everything can be steamed and boiled. 4 unknown ingredients. No matter how good their resistance to poison is, the head has to be removed and roasted before they can be eaten. Ruminants have special stomachs that can store a certain amount of water. Under extreme conditions, they can be drunk directly. Frying is cheating. Almost no one can resist food made with this cooking method. It's crunchy. Gree, looking at the vicious words written by Brew in the Gourmet Guide, and thinking of the surname of a person who stood at the top of the food chain in his previous life, the young blue dragon was silent for a moment. He made up his mind to never eat in the devil's stomach again. Clang. Keys and Brew only had a short conversation before Gree finished processing the ingredients. He inserted the kitchen knife on the chopping board. Then, he picked up the processed acid mistworm. Without using any other tools, he grabbed it with his hands and put it into the boiling oil. Sizzle. The sound of oil being fried sounded. The white and tender meat tumbled up and down with the boiling oil and was soon covered in a layer of golden yellow. When the acid mistworm's skin was burnt yellow from the explosion, Gris seized the opportunity and quickly reached out his hand to grab the cooked food when it flipped over to the surface of the boiling oil, scooping it out of the frying pan. With the oil soup, he put the yellow acid mistworm into a basin of clay. With a rub and a roll, a layer of clay shell appeared on the surface of the food. Swish! Gree picked up his kitchen knife again and cut a hole in the clay shell along the acid mistworm's body. He clamped the 2 ends and squeezed with a little force. The clay shell and the hard skin of the acid mistworm were all peeled off. After sprinkling various spices with yellow oil, the milky white fried acid mistworm was placed on a plate and placed on the bar counter. With a flick of his finger, he pushed the plate in front of Brew, who couldn't wait to try the new food. It looks and smells good. Just as Keys was hesitating whether to go back on a vow he had just made in his heart and order this food to try, Gree wiped off the oil on his hand with a rag whose original color could no longer be seen and extended his hand in front of him. You must be the commander that Mr. Brew mentioned. I welcome your excellency's guidance. After shaking hands with Keys, Gree bowed respectfully and said, I've discussed with Mr. Brew before. As long as I can continue to work in this shop and provide stable supplies for this shop, you can take back the ownership of this place at any time. To be honest, this chef who left a deep impression on the young blue dragon was actually quite good at cooking. In addition, Gree's request was easy to satisfy, so Keys didn't intend to care about the difference between returning the ownership and taking back the ownership. Of course, a good habit couldn't be discarded. After negotiating with Gree, Keys immediately took out a labor employment contract and pushed it in front of Gree with a smile. Welcome, but please sign this contract first. What surprised Keys was that when Gree saw the contract in front of him, his face suddenly turned pale and his hands began to clench. Chapter 358. With the lie detection spell, Keys quickly figured out the whole story. It was nothing new. The mortals who could come here had basically signed a contract with the devil. But Gris's experience was one of the more unlucky ones. He was originally a warrior, but his intestines were cut open by the enemy on the battlefield. Just as he was about to die from the loss of blood and pain, A contract demon who went to the material plane for a daily stroll found this man. "If I give you a chance to continue living, I'm willing." After a few simple words, a contract was signed and turned into the most inconspicuous pattern on the contract's coat. In order to save time, and also for cost considerations, the devil did not use healing spells on Gris. The contract demon might have high surgical skills. He directly pulled out the damaged digestive organs in Gris's abdomen and replaced it with a new set of intestines and intestines. The intestines came from the devil who died on the contract demon's dissection table. Was there a missing link? That's right. The word mercy never existed in the devil's dictionary. When the contract demon performed surgery, he did not have the habit of anesthetizing. The tragic Gris went through a process more painful than death before he was reborn. If he had the chance to choose again, he would probably rather die than agree to the devil's conditions. However, it was too late. After climbing out of the pile of corpses on the battlefield, Gris was brought to Bator by the power of the contract not long after. To be honest, he did not show any special talent at that time. So when he received the task from the front line of the bloody battle, the contract demon did not think much and put Gris and some other mortal slaves into the servant army and sent them to the plain of the acid fog canyon. Although Gris believed himself to be an excellent warrior, his combat power was not outstanding among the soldiers from all over the multiverse. There were many who were stronger and more quick-witted than him. However, those people might not have lived as long as Gris. At least among the mortals who came to the city of the acid fog canyon with him, he rarely saw familiar faces. The reason was simple. In the beginning, Bader's logistics department had no food at all. All the mortal servants had to find their own food to fill their stomachs. Some even began to hunt other mortals for food. Even for mortals from other worlds, who were quite different in appearance from their own kind, eating other intelligent creatures when they were hungry would at most cause a little psychological discomfort. However, they still underestimated the bottomless abyss, or rather, the acid fog canyon's power of pollution. No matter how they cooked food, even if they ate other mortals raw, their mortal stomachs could not withstand the food contaminated by the abyss. Disease was inevitable. For a very long time, the city felt like it was soaked in a cesspool every day. Every corner and even every mortal in the city reeked of the excrement of those with gastrointestinal problems. It should be noted that these people were the servants in charge of taking care of the Megalosaurus army. With the Megalosaurus' sensitive sense of smell, other than the black dragons who naturally liked the stench of decay, the rest of the Penishade Megalosaurus could not withstand the smell of the servants. It was said that a powerful red dragon whose father was a high-ranking member of the Evil Dragon Council and who was also a legendary level or above was blinded by the stench. He directly went to the Bator camp's military supply department and had a friendly physical persuasion with the quartermaster. Moreover, there were indeed signs of chaos in the city. The Batsu people naturally could not tolerate a situation where there was no order. Many high-ranking demon commanders of the Expeditionary Army jointly wrote a letter to their superiors to accuse the logistics department of inaction. Due to the two-pronged approach, the logistics department of the Bator Expeditionary Army in Avernus finally agreed to regularly distribute relatively safe food to the mortal city in the abyss. Moreover, the amount was never fully allocated. However, the food was only relatively safe. Although it was certainly not contaminated by the chaotic power of the abyss before being transported through the portal, the ingredients themselves were not very healthy. Many of the ingredients were even too disgusting to look at directly. Therefore, many mortals in this abyss city eventually died because they did not have a strong stomach. And these problems were not a problem for Gree at all, because he had the stomach of a demon. Gree even had no problem eating the food directly obtained from the abyss, such as the ubiquitous acid mistworms. Due to the suppression of the power of order, the mortals near the Bator camp did not have to worry about being parasitized by the acid mistworms. And because Gree's father was a chef, he himself had mastered some cooking skills. Therefore, he began to try to develop various kinds of food in the abyss. At the very least, he could remove the contamination in it, and allow mortals to eat it normally. Up until now, he had developed several dishes that ordinary mortals could eat normally. It was because of this unique skill that he was able to receive the care of the privileged class in this city and become the head chef and employee of this tavern. The so-called privileged class was a specialty of the lawful evil camp. As long as it was an area radiated by the Bator forces, they were everywhere. And the privileged class in this city, apart from a small number of powerful Megalosaurus servants who filled them later on, were actually the mercenaries from other planes under Keys. Chapter 359. After settling the ownership of the Devil's Stomach and comforting his only employee, Keys left the tavern with Brew and went to the medical camp. As he expected, the medical camp had been taken over by a privileged class in the city. However, the young Blue Dragon, who held the highest authority in the city, had personally intervened. They did not even need to use physical persuasion to regain the rights to the medical camp. Just like before, Keys appointed the experienced Ogre Gourmet as the quartermaster and was in charge of the distribution of resources. He dragged the privileged class he had just met to negotiate with the most powerful person in the privileged class. He also wanted to find out more about the Yugoloth magic caravan. In the past, the mercenaries from other planes were mostly villains that the devils had found from various planes of the multiverse. Some of them were even gang leaders who were surrounded by their underlings. Now, they had all become the local tyrants of this abyss city. However, the person at the top of the privileged class, or rather, the most powerful villain, was not the first batch of mercenaries from the other plane. Instead, it was a latecomer who was completely made up of rocks. Therefore, he was not popular among the privileged class. My lord, that guy claims to be the champion of the court arena. It is said that he comes from a plane called Cronin. The former head doctor of the medical camp who followed Keys was a privileged person who took over Keys after Keys went on vacation. He did not have the dignity of a professional monk, and he did not have the superior look that he usually had when patients begged him. Instead, he looked like a Philistin salesman. He introduced the young Blue Dragon enthusiastically, afraid that he would miss out on any information. Although we can't defeat him, we're not that bad either. At least, no one called him the champion of combat as he requested. Everyone calls him the Cronin, or some hot-tempered people call him the Stone Man. The evil monk rambled all the way, but Quest didn't interrupt him. Because from the first sentence of the monk's introduction, the young Blue Dragon immediately realized the problem, and his brain entered a high-speed state of thinking. The champion of the court arena. If ordinary people heard this sentence, they might not have much of a reaction. But thanks to the excessive amount of knowledge passed down in his childhood, Keys's mind stored knowledge that was very unfamiliar to many creatures, even to ordinary Megalosaurus. He knew that Cord was not an ordinary name. It was the name of a true god. Without considering the Megalosaurus race, Cold was even more powerful than Tiamat, who was only a lesser divine power. After all, this was a hedonistic god who belonged to the chaotic good faction. He possessed the divine domains of strength, movement, sports, combat, courage, and had ascended to mid-level divine power thousands of years ago. Most of the time, this true god with the title of wrestler appeared as a red-haired, red-bearded man with a robust and muscular body. In order to show how strong he was, he usually didn't wear anything on his upper body. He only wore a red battle belt and a battle skirt. He wore blue boots and gloves sewn from the skin of the immemorial white dragon. In one hand, he held a huge dragon-slaying sword named Malka. Many knowledgeable Megalosaurus speculated that this god was very likely to kill Megalosaurus, although he had never said so, and hoped to show his strength and bravery in this way. And because Cold was a high and mighty god, his followers, priests, and fanatical worshippers among the mortals were likely to have the impulse to imitate Cold from a subjective point of view. In other words, if the Stone Man from the Cronin dimension was really Cord's arena champion, then he would definitely not have the idea of serving the Megalosaurus army. He probably had other purposes for approaching the Megalosaurus. For example, to slay a dragon. Of course, so far, The above was only Keys's guess. However, he was indeed interested in the stone golem from the Cronin dimension. He wanted to find out the golem's motive. From the infrastructure school to the benevolent school of reasoning, the daily life in the bottomless abyss is really chaotic. Suddenly, he had a hint of understanding in his heart. The spirit crystal servant hovering in the sea of consciousness of the young blue dragon flickered, but then it returned to normal. Keys felt a sense of approval from it. Some kind of obscure but extremely grand energy fluctuation seemed to have increased a little. I almost forgot that the spirit crystal servant still contains a trace of source power from the bottomless abyss. It is said that those demon lords essentially rely on the number of deep origins to differentiate their strength. Because the amount of abyss source power symbolizes the different degrees of recognition of the abyss consciousness, and those who are recognized by the abyss consciousness can be successful in the bottomless abyss. Keys pondered, but he did not have the intention to study this abyss source power now. Firstly, the time and place were not suitable. If he exposed the secret of having the abyss source power in the Batsa Devil's camp at the front line of the bloody war, he might be directly branded as a traitor and be hunted to death by the Batsa Devil. Secondly, the spirit crystal's servant absorbed the deep origin power. Although Keys did not have the opportunity to use it now, the spirit crystal servant could indeed help its owner to be resurrected after his death. With the support of the deep origin power, if he encountered any accident in the bottomless abyss, it would be safer when he was resurrected. At least there would be fewer twists and turns. Therefore, the young blue dragon did not want to study this power now. He did not need to take the risk. I'd better be an honest detective. The winner is the one who survives to the end. Letting the monk from the evil camp lead the way, Keys quickly passed through the streets and alleys of the city. Unlike the cities in other places, the city built in the bottomless abyss had the infiltration of the chaos law in its layout. If the cities in other places were two-dimensional, the structure of the city of the abyss was actually three-dimensional. The city was built little by little around many huge stalagmites that rose abruptly from the ground. Many of the residential areas were actually caves formed by digging stalagmites. They were artificially formed stone bridges with spells, ropeways made of fibers from some plants that grew tenaciously in the acid fog canyon, lifts made of ropes, pulleys, and planks. All kinds of methods were used to connect them into one. However, Quest didn't expect to encounter such a method of travel in order to reach the stone golem's residence. You usually sit on this thing. Go up? Keys asked, a little surprised. Chapter 360. Isn't that so? Every time I see that stone man, it's a terrible experience. The evil monk replied embarrassedly, and then his face showed an indignant expression. It's all because of that guy's pet, a gnome that came here from some corner of the multiverse. Lord Stim isn't a pet. Lord Stim is that stone man's master. You stupid, ignorant, obscene creature. The sound of someone wiping glass with a wet rag suddenly rang out. A humanoid creature about the height of a 3- or 4-year-old mortal child hopped out of a cave below the stalagmite. This creature's appearance was very recognizable. Slender arms, lead gray skin, a head that was too large for its size, an anxious expression, and a pair of sharp eyes that were ready to observe everything. He was an underground gnome. If he was born with a shiny bald head, he might even have some gray dwarf blood in him. Faced with Stim's angry rebuke, the evil monk's face turned pale. If he didn't know that anyone who provoked this gnome would mysteriously disappear that day, he would have already rushed over and rained punches and kicks on this guy with a foul mouth. But he didn't dare to do that. He didn't even dare to refute. At least, before the young blue dragon decided to completely destroy Cronin's stone man, he didn't dare to do so. Just you wait, damn gnome. One day, I'll tear your mouth apart. The evil monk viciously swore. Perhaps it was because Quest did not belittle himself. The target of Stim's scolding had always been the evil monk. Or perhaps it was because he was bored of scolding others. So Stim finally stopped scolding. According to the old rules, Stim impatiently raised his arm and pointed at a catapult beside him. The stone man lives on the 15th level of the stalagmite. There are no stairs connecting there. If you want to go there, you can only take my catapult to the sky. I know levitation, against the rules. I know teleportation, against the rules. This gnome named Stim reminded Keys of some game developers he met in his previous life. Players weren't cheating. There were obviously better ways to clear the level, but they had to limit their freedom. Unless the young blue dragon's eyes suddenly lit up. I'm willing to pay for the ride. The evil monk looked at Keys with some surprise. He had seen the stone man a few times before. Although the experience of riding the so-called catapult to the sky wasn't good, at least he wasn't charged. Wasn't this person in front of him the highest ruler of the Abyss City? Why would he take the initiative to pay? But just as the evil monk's smooth mind was spinning rapidly, but still unable to come up with an answer, Stim, who is rarely amiable towards others, suddenly smiled and gave Karth a thumbs up. Why, sir, you've received Stim's goodwill. This service package is only 10% off, and it's 3 calamity coins. The gnome stretched out his slender palm to Keys without hesitation. He was no longer the poor young blue dragon who only had the soul prism. He immediately took out a small piece of gold, which was slightly more than 3 calamity coins. Generous sir, you probably consider the loss of making gold into calamity coins. At the same time, this isn't a scam. Stim is very satisfied. I've decided to upgrade the service package for you for free. Please go to your seat and get ready. Following the gnome's words, Keys' expression suddenly became slightly startled. He felt an obscure energy fluctuation touching him. Although the initial judgment was that there was no malicious intent, with the young blue dragon's powerful perception, he could naturally feel the extraordinariness of this energy. This Stim isn't simple, Keys secretly guessed. Fortunately, I haven't had a conflict with him for the time being. Keys did as he was told. It was called the Catapult Ascension Device, which was actually a modified catapult. With a flash of inspiration, he secretly pinched the seat under him. There was no damage at all. It's really unusual. The hardness of this material has already surpassed most of the high-grade enchanted weapons. In Batsu's camp, it's estimated that only a few demons can obtain this material, but can only be used as a toy material for this gnome. Just as he was secretly shocked, Stim skipped over. At this time, Keys realized that the gnome had installed a row of springs on the soles of his shoes. He stuffed a package into the young blue dragon's arms. Dear guest, this is a normal service package. If there's a problem with the Catapult Ascension device, you can pull the button in midair, and the package will instantly be filled with gas. As long as you aim it at the ground, you can land softly and basically won't be injured. Keys originally thought that it was a parachute, but who knew that it was actually an air mattress? This gnome's thinking was indeed extraordinary. Then, Stim walked to the catapult, adjusted the latitude and longitude again, and pulled a lever. The result was once again out of the young blue dragon's expectations. He was not ejected, but many anti-fall nets were ejected from the top of the stalagmite. This is the service package after your upgrade. It adds an extra layer of protection to the Catapult Ascension device. Keys gave Stim a kind smile. Stim nodded slightly and suddenly pressed another lever. The catapult's winch loosened, and the energy stored in the spring steel was suddenly released, causing the catapult arm to rise at high speed. Keys, who was sitting at the top of the catapult arm, soared into the sky like an arrow released from a bow. Then, he landed steadily on a protruding platform on the 15th layer of the stalagmite. There was no collision, no scraping, and no free fall from too high. After watching Keys's catapult ascension process, the evil monk, who was waiting at the side, couldn't help but have his eyes light up. But just as he walked to the catapult, Stim glanced at him contemptuously and pulled 2 levers. The anti-fall nets on the stalagmite were all retracted first, and then a ragged rope ladder fell from above. Sorry, esteemed customer. After using it, routine equipment maintenance. You can climb up yourself. After saying that, Stim skipped back to the cave he lived in. It seemed that routine maintenance only needed him to do it remotely. The evil monk was speechless. By the time he experienced the rope ladder suddenly breaking twice, the evil monk finally climbed to the protruding platform on the 15th layer of the stalagmite thanks to his special skills, light fall and cloud ladder, to save his life. Apart from the fact that he was exhausted, he didn't make Keys wait for long. Go and knock on the door. The young blue dragon ordered. P.S. Thank you for the 1,000 cheating coins tip. I will update the chapter later. I don't want to fail. Thank you for your support. Chapter 361. It was not the first time the evil monk had come here. Like many of the big shots of the privileged class, he had visited the Stone Man either alone or in groups to deal with the city's affairs. Thus, he was not unfamiliar with the Stone Man's residence. It was strange that at their level in the city, they did not need to serve the Megalosaurus. The work that was assigned to them would naturally be done by their followers in exchange for the protection of the big shots. But this Stone Man from Cronin was an exception among the privileged class. He would go to the Megalosaurus army to serve them every day. Because of his brute strength and decent elemental resistance, he would also take on the task of cleaning the scales and teeth of some powerful Megalosaurus. He would never get tired of it. Because of his good technique and serious attitude, the Stone Man would even receive some material rewards from the Megalosaurus. This was definitely not a normal thing. With how stingy the Pinochet dragons were, they would at most give some verbal rewards for services that satisfied them. As for material rewards, Dragon's breath was also considered material. How about a breath? To be able to receive a gift from the Pinochet dragons, even if it was just some scales and teeth that were damaged in battle, it was enough to show how good the Stone Man's work was. After all, the Megalosaurus was full of treasures. As long as they were slightly processed, the broken scales and broken teeth could easily be made into high-quality materials for weapons and equipment. In a place like the Bloody War, where chaos and battles were happening at all times, good weapons and equipment meant a chance to live longer. It's because the Stone Man has a lot of good stuff that the Yugolos caravans are willing to trade with him. The evil monk suddenly thought of something and smiled as he rubbed his bald head. Originally, he had planned to use his own narration to make this big shot beside him think of killing him for his treasures. But as a member of the mercenary camp from another plane, he suddenly remembered the scene where Keys transformed into his true form and massacred the demons. He was a Megalosaurus, and an exceptionally powerful one at that. Why would he be interested in the junk in the Stone Man's hands? The evil monk's dirty thoughts could not be hidden from a young blue dragon who had powerful psionic abilities. However, he had no intention of exposing this fellow. Just like before, from his words, Keys still obtained some additional information. Collecting materials from the Megalosaurus. Is that Stone Man preparing to slay the dragon? In the multiverse, although there were not many cases of mortals killing Megalosaurus, it was not rare either. However, in most cases, the Megalosaurus that were killed were mostly young dragons like Keys, although he felt a little guilty thinking that way. Before the Megalosaurus reached the stage of youth, its strength and physical defense did not reach the level where it could ignore most mortal weapons. Its scales could be cut by swords, penetrated by spears, and smashed by axes. This situation would change greatly after they became young dragons and adult dragons. Even if mortals picked up some enchanted weapons, it would be difficult for them to break through the Megalosaurus's defense with their weak strength. And to kill Megalosaurus of this age, mortals would have to prepare a dragon-slaying weapon for themselves. And the so-called dragon-slaying weapon was actually just a general term. Weapons of the gods, special magical tools, extraordinary weapons with high-level enchantments. These equipment could allow mortals to kill Megalosaurus. However, the most common dragon-slaying weapon would be those that were originally made from the body of the Megalosaurus. If the Stone Man from Cronin had collected enough Megalosaurus materials, he could have made himself a divine weapon that could pierce through the scales of the Pinochet Megalosaurus. When the time came, He could have taken the opportunity to serve the Megalosaurus army, to look for a Pinochet dragon that was injured or exhausted from battle. As long as the stone man acted quickly, it was very likely that he could successfully kill a Megalosaurus. But how could he guarantee that the Megalosaurus would not struggle? What if it struggled and alerted the Megalosaurus army? Keyes suddenly remembered that the stone man had been in contact with the Yugolos caravan. Those neutral demons may have a poison in their hands that could quickly kill the Megalosaurus. If the dragon-slaying weapon was dipped in poison, the stone man would have a great chance of escaping after he succeeded. Thinking of this, Keyes could not help but frown, and his footsteps quickened. Although the above conjecture was only a conclusion that he deduced based on some clues, there was no actual evidence. But if the stone man succeeded, whether he could escape or not was one thing. As the current highest-ranking officer in this city, Keyes would also be jointly responsible. And almost without thinking too much, the young blue dragon could conclude that the Yugolos, who had special information channels of the Blood War, probably knew that he had taken over the Abyss City. Fat and sweet is not enough to fill the mouth. Light and warm is not enough to fill the body, Quith commented on his old acquaintance. It seems that the Judgment Fiend is still not satisfied with the rich benefits that the blood battle brought. It still wants to cause trouble behind my back. Since he knew that he had been schemed against, Keyes would definitely not be blindly optimistic. In a lower realm, the Yugolos were famous for eating from both ends, eating the upper realm and the lower realm. Perhaps the Judgment Demon had already sold all the information about him to the Tyrant Worm. But before dealing with external threats, we must first settle the internal problems. Dealing with the Stone Man from the Cronin dimension is the most important thing now. Because he had just seen Stim, the young blue dragon did not want to take things too far. It was easy to kick the door and turn the Stone Man into a pile of rubble. But such a violent action might cause Keyes unexpected trouble. After all, the young blue dragon was still a little wary of the mysterious dwarf powerhouse. With the evil monk leading the way, Keyes stepped into the cave where the Stone Man lived. Unlike the other privileged classes in the city who were often surrounded by people, the residence of the Cronin Stone Man was very quiet. There was no noise from his underlings shouting and toasting. Maybe it's because he's a stone. That guy is old-fashioned and unsociable. He doesn't have any underlings following him. Inside the cave, the evil monk continued to introduce to Keyes. But to be honest, that guy's strength is not bad. Of course, it can't be compared to you. He's very disciplined and has set up a sports room next to his room. Following the evil monk's finger, Keyes saw an independent room in front of the door. There were no windows in the room, but because the walls were inlaid with fluorite for illumination, the room was quite bright. Heavy barbells made of stone and iron were neatly stacked in the corner of the room. In the middle of the room, there was a training tool that looked like a wooden dummy, but was completely made of stone. There were many signs of wear and tear on it. Self-discipline makes people strong, Keyes thought to himself. What an ambitious stone man. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.